everybody. Okay, I think we have everybody, so I think you start.
Hi, everybody. If I haven't had the chance to meet you, I'm Justin Falb. I'm the designated federal officer for the reconstituted BDAC, and I want to thank you all for coming out to volunteer and take your time to serve the public interest today. To my left is the distinguished Elizabeth Bowles. She's going to be the chair, and I'm going to pass it over to her.
Thank you. First of all, for everyone who has been serving on this committee for the last 2 years with me, I want to welcome you back and thank you for all of the hard work you put in and for signing up for another set of terms. And for those of you who are new, I'm very looking forward to meeting you and working with you and moving this process forward. We have a lot to accomplish. I want to thank the chairman again for the appointment and to welcome everybody. And with that, I'm going to officially gavel in the meeting. See, I don't get to use the gavel that often. I like to gavel it in, gavel it out. Yay.
It's a good feeling.
It is. It's a great feeling. So as most of you know, my name's Elizabeth Bowles. I've been the chair of the BDAC for the last 2 years, and I'm very honored to be asked to serve in that role again. I am the president and CEO of a company called Aristotle out of Little Rock, Arkansas. We are a fixed wireless broadband service provider, and I have also been involved with the fixed wireless industry for several years, working with WISPA, which is the trade association for that. And with that, I'm going to pass it to my esteemed co-chair, Mr. David Young, to introduce himself.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Thank you all for coming. Working with the National League of Cities, I think we've accomplished a lot in the last 2 years. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what we can accomplish in the next 2 years. I see many familiar faces, many new faces. This will be an exciting time. Thank you all for agreeing to work on this very important topic.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to introduce the chairman of the FCC, Mr. Ajit Pai.
Well, thank you, Chair Bowles, to Vice Chair Young, and to all the members of the BDAC. I appreciate your having me here to spend about, I understand, 60 minutes talking about the history of telecom regulation.
Oh, we thought you were going to be here for 2 hours.
Oh, I'm just going to read the Code of Federal Regulations.
Perfect.
But no, in all seriousness, I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. I know you've got a lot on your plates, and this is volunteer duty on top of your important jobs. And I can't express enough how much I appreciate the work. You know, when I think about some of the significant cultural markers in history, Star Wars, Godfather, the Prince albums, the one thing you notice is that they all had sequels. And I thought the BDAC, in my view at least, is one of those markers, and so that's why we wanted to reconstitute it and bring it back. So for those of you who are here for the first time, thank you for agreeing to serve. We appreciate your volunteering in advance and hope you find the experience here fulfilling and enjoyable. For those of you who are here for a second time, y'all never learn. But no, seriously, we were so grateful to you for the work you did on the previous iteration and are thrilled that you've stepped up to the plate for the next mission, which is absolutely critical in my view, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. But I will say that the knowledge and the expertise and the dedication that all of you have shown and will show on this next iteration is so important to the Commission's work. And we spend a lot of time on these issues, and as you saw with the previous iteration of the committee, that work that you do is not academic. We try to put it into practice to the maximum extent possible. I especially want to thank our distinguished chair and vice chair for agreeing to serve. That's why we pay you the big bucks, after all. But your expert guidance, and I think the way, your model of leadership, I think, is a great, it helps us reach consensus in a way that is not always easy on some of these issues. So thanks to each of you for agreeing to serve. In addition, I would also like to thank the stars of the FCC. It's not the folks on the 8th floor, as we call it. It's the FCC's terrific career staff who do so much terrific work day in and day out. Some of them are seated around me. The illustrious KMO, or Chris Monteith, as many know her, the chief of our Wireline Competition Bureau, Chief Donald Stockdale of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and the other terrific staff who I don't have time to name. But I did want to identify in particular Justin Falb. I've gotten over his bitterness at beating me in a fantasy football league a couple of years ago, and now he has agreed to step up and serve as the DFO, the designated federal official for this committee. And he steps into a line of illustrious DFOs who've served in the past, Brian Hurley, Paul Dari, and Deborah Salons and Zhangming Shang. We really appreciate the work that they have done. Justin is joined by Zach Ross and Daryl Pay as deputy DFOs, and so I'd like to thank all three of them for agreeing to serve in this important role, helping to coordinate the communications between the BDAC and the Commission itself. Now, as I mentioned, the Commission does depend on the work of experts like you across the many areas that we regulate and work on, and this is especially true when we work on challenging and consequential issues, such as how we can improve our nation's broadband infrastructure, expand access to broadband services, and close the digital divide. And so the issues that we are asking you to consider, to debate, and to come to consensus on are difficult, but they are of paramount importance. And I see that every day when I travel around the country. I've now been to 45 states and the territories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And I can tell you from one of my first visits to the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in South Dakota in 2017 to a visit to the Chickasaw Nation 2 weeks ago in rural Ada, Oklahoma, these issues matter to people across the country a great deal. Much of their infrastructure is important, roads, bridges, schools, et cetera, but the number one thing I hear is that people want the access to that digital platform in order to improve their lives, to strengthen their families, to make their communities more prosperous, and ultimately to benefit the country. And this broadband infrastructure is even more critical when it comes to public safety matters. Network resiliency in the face of a disaster is absolutely vital. Access to broadband services in low-income communities is absolutely vital. Workforce development for broadband infrastructure deployment. These issues are vital, getting people jobs that can help them improve their situation. Now, I understand that these issues might not be on the front page every day. We all, of course, want to know about who Chris Pratt might have married yesterday. But at the end of the day, what really matters is knowing that you can have the broadband infrastructure to stream stories about stuff like that. I guess I should, yeah. Well, anyway, leave Chris Pratt out of it. Nonetheless, these issues are really important for Americans every day, and your expertise helps us do that. And the first BDAC was a great success. I'm confident that the talent arrayed around the table will help us get to a successful resolution of these various issues in the next iteration. And so again, thanks to all of the members, new and old, all of you young, of course. And I really look forward to the work you're going to do in the time to come. And if you need anything at all, feel free to let us know, either through Justin, through our career staff, or to me directly. We really appreciate the time you put in, and it is not time that will be wasted. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. And with that, I would actually like to introduce Wireline Competition Bureau Chief. These are very long titles, I apologize. Wireline Competition Bureau Chief Chris Munson.
Thank you very much, Chair Bowles. And Vice Chair David Young, very nice to meet you. Nice to be here. We look forward to working with you. It's really hard to follow the chairman in making remarks. I'm not nearly as funny or interesting or talented. But I do want to first begin by thanking him for his leadership. The BDAC was his idea, his creation, and had a very successful first charter. The first 2 years, the members of the BDAC, as you well know, many of you who are returning, did some incredibly important work that the Commission used in many of its rulemaking proceedings. For those of you that have signed up for a second go at it, thank you so much. You're gluttons for punishment, but we really do appreciate it. And for those of you who are joining the BDAC for the first time, thank you so much for agreeing to serve. Your time and your expertise and the commitment that you bring to the BDAC is really just a shining example of commitment to the public interest, and we greatly appreciate all of your work. I do want to also take a moment to thank the staff who works tirelessly on the BDAC efforts. In the last go-around, Brian Hurley and Paul Dari, Jimmy Shong, and Deborah Salins. And then for this go-around, Mr. Justin Falb, the new DFO, Zach Ross, Daryl Pye, the new deputy DFOs, and I really appreciate their agreeing to take on these roles. You do have very interesting issues, as the chairman outlined, for you to consider in this iteration of the BDAC. I want you to know that the staff of the FCC, the staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau, is here to support your efforts. As the chairman mentioned, whether it's through Justin or Zach or myself or any number of people that are here to provide that extra set of hands, that feedback, answer your questions, help in whatever way you might need assistance, please call on us. And so with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Stockdale.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome. I learned long ago never to talk longer than my boss, particularly when he or she is much more articulate than I. So let me just start by thanking you in advance for your hard work, dedication, and service. I look forward to your recommendations on how to increase deployment of advanced wireless services in low-income and rural areas, to improve the resiliency of broadband networks, and to improve training so as to facilitate the deployment and maintenance of broadband networks, including small cell deployments. The first BDAC was incredibly productive and successful, and I expect that this BDAC will be equally so. Let me stop bloviating at this point and let you actually get to productive dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chiefs, I appreciate your comments. I'd like to echo one thing that has been said here, which is that the last BDAC was very productive, and while some of its recommendations are reflected in FCC rulings, I'd like to say that there's also been change at the state level and also on the Hill. I had conversations yesterday with legislators who are actively looking at the work of this committee, and we have had changes in my home state of Arkansas. A lot of the BDAC's recommendations ended up in the state broadband plan. There have been statutory changes that have taken place in Arkansas as a result of this body's work. So I would like to congratulate all of you, and I'm very much looking forward to continuing that track record. So at this point in time, I would like to ask the BDAC members to introduce themselves briefly. I think you all know that this entire meeting stands between us and lunch. So I would like to ask everyone to please introduce yourself briefly, just about a minute if you can. And first we'll thank the chairman again for taking the time to come down. We appreciate it. And thank you, Chief Unruh. Thank you, Stockton.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Thanks. So we've already done our thing, so I will start, I guess, at the end of the table. I cannot see who that is down there. Jonathan Adelstein, please. Thank you. Sorry, you were blocked by people. We'll start here.
Yes, Jonathan Adelstein. I am the CEO of the Wireless Infrastructure Association, and thrilled to be back again. I think you're right, under your chairmanship and your vice chairmanship, we did enormously good work in the last BDAC, and I'm thrilled and honored to be back again and to go at it again.
Thank you.
So despite the name tag, I am not Jim Matheson. I'm Brian O'Hara, his designated alternate. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the electric cooperatives, we have 900 members across the country, serve about 56% of the landmass, but only about 1/8% of the population, so a lot of the rural areas. And of our 900 members, about 150 or so are now deploying broadband, and we know we have another 200 that are in feasibility. So we kind of straddle both things here with the disaster recovery on the energy and telecommunications side.
Good morning, I'm Larry Hanson. I'm the Executive Director of the Georgia Municipal Association. In that capacity, we represent all 538 cities in the state of Georgia. Prior to that, I served as city manager in Valdosta, Georgia for 22 years. I served on the previous BDAC and was very honored to be the vice chair of the Model Code for Municipalities Working Group.
Good morning. I'm Julie Carney. I'm head of regulatory affairs for a company called Loon. We are an Alphabet company, a sister of Google. We were a moonshot. We're putting balloons in the stratosphere. to deliver internet service to underserved and unserved areas around the globe. Many of you may have heard that we delivered service in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria in 2017. We most recently delivered service in Peru after they had an 8.0 earthquake. So we are a loony idea, but we are on our way to being commercial. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Bob DeBrew, and I am with TDS Telecom, which started out 50 years ago as a group of small rural ILECs in a few states. We're now in 25 states, and we are no longer a telephone company. We are now a broadband company. I have been involved on the federal side pretty much my entire career there and have helped work with the FCC in terms of shaping the federal programs, the universal service programs, and also intercarrier compensation and those types of things that have allowed us to build out our networks farther and farther and farther.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Good to be back. I'm a Vice President of Telecommunication and Spectrum Policy at Multicultural Media and Telecom Council. It's a long name, MMTC we go by. I oversee MMTC's policy on spectrum, 5G, small cells, and also workforce development. We have been engaged with Department of Labor's apprenticeship initiative for more than 2 years now, and we work with WI and TIREP in the first 2 years to expand the apprenticeship for telecommunication industry. I'm also a faculty member at University of Maryland, where I teach for professional masters in telecom program for nearly 10 years now, where I've designed several graduate courses on DAS, small cell infrastructure, Wi-Fi fundamentals, and such as. I also chair the Workforce Development Committee at the Innovation and Technology Council of WIA, where we co-authored some good papers, and I'm sure that throughout the BDAC engagement, I'm going to bring some of those papers here and bring some citation as well. Looking forward to working with you all. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. New addition to the BDAC, so good to meet you all, and happy to be here. I'm Tom Struble. I'm an attorney with R Street Institute. For those of you who aren't familiar, it's a public policy think tank based here in D.C., dedicated to policy research and outreach to promote free markets and limited effective government, as the tagline. I work with the Tech and Innovation Policy team, doing a lot of telecom broadband deployment, mostly at the federal level, but also state and local, including a big broadband scorecard project we finished last year, and we'll be updating periodically, ranking all the states on various broadband deployment criteria we were able to come up with. But yeah, excited to be here. Looking forward to it.
I'm Kurt Stamp with Cox Communications. I handle our government affairs for the middle of the country, including our shared state of Arkansas. Prior to that, I've been doing telecom policy for most of my career primarily at the state level, but it's been some time doing federal work as well.
Hi, I'm Dilip Shahari with TIA, the Telecommunications Industry Association. We are the trade association that represents the manufacturers and suppliers of telecom equipment, so everything from fiber optic cable to routers to base stations and cell phones, basically all of the hardware that forms telecom networks. Excited to be here. Thanks.
Hi, I'm David Dunn. Am I on? Mm-hmm. Good, okay, here we go. I should know how to use this by now. I got pretty familiar with it last time. Hi, I'm David Don, Vice President Regulatory Policy at Comcast. For those who don't know Comcast, we started as a family-run cable company in Tupelo, Mississippi. Today we are the largest ISP in America in 39 states and the District of Columbia, and I look forward to exploring the new issues we're taking on this year.
I'm Alan Bell. I'm the Joint Use Manager for Georgia Power, which is a member of Southern Company. As everyone knows, electric infrastructure is key to the communication industry's goals and serving 5G, and we're glad to have a seat at the table.
Hi, I'm Kelly Cole, and I represent the Utah Education and Telehealth Network. We connect all of the higher ed, public ed facilities, as well as a lot of Utah's libraries, many small rural healthcare facilities. This is my second time at the BDAC. I was representing the state of Utah the last time I was here, and I'm glad to be back and work with all of you again.
Tim Walden, I'm with CenturyLink. My responsibility includes all field operations as well as network implementation across North America. CenturyLink, we're a global enterprise provider, and we provide consumer broadband services across 37 states. 33 of those are active in the CAF program today, and happy to be a part of working through to advance broadband deeper within the network.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nancy Werner. I'm the General Counsel of another long name, the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors. We go by NATOA, so it's a much easier name to remember. We represent the officers and advisors. We represent our local governments, and we're very happy to be here and be a part of this committee.
Good morning. I'm Charles McKee. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs for Federal and State Regulatory at Sprint. And this is my second go-around, so you're all familiar with me, I hope, and look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Leticia Latino, CEO of Neptuno. We are a tower manufacturer. We've been engineering, installing, and building towers for the past 50 years. This is my first time in the BDAC, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
Hi, I'm Carlos Gutierrez. I am the Head of Policy and Legal for LGBT Technology Partnership and Institute. We're a nonprofit that examines the connection between technology and LGBT communities, focusing on privacy and digital divide. We have a special kind of focus on rural and underserved communities because LGBT individuals in those communities can be more isolated and rely on broadband connection for community and services in a way that other communities may not. So this is very timely for us, and we're very excited to be part of this committee.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ken Simon. I'm the General Counsel of Crown Castle. Crown Castle is an owner and operator of a unique portfolio of cell phone towers, small cells, and fiber across the country. And it is a privilege to have served on the first BDAC together with our chair, vice chair, and so many of you. And I'm really pleased to be continuing on and working with all of you as we go forward.
Good morning. Karen Charles Peterson from the Massachusetts Department of Telecommunications and Cable, but representing NARUC here on the BDAC. I'm so happy to be here once again, and thank you so much, Chairwoman, for your wonderful introduction and welcoming us back again. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Larry Thompson. I am the CEO of Vantage Point Solutions. We do engineering and consulting work, doing broadband engineering. I'm here representing NECA, the National Exchange Carriers Association, which is affiliated with about 1,000 or so small rural providers across the United States. And we do engineering consulting for a lot of those small companies, as well as some of the members here of the BDAC, like GeoLinks and Google and CenturyLink as well.
Good morning, Melissa Slauson, General Counsel and VP of Government Affairs and Education for GeoLinks. I am serving as an alternate for my CEO, Skylar Ditchfield, who was unable to make it. GeoLinks is a WISP based in California. We're one of the fastest growing telecoms in America and a recent recipient of CAF II award funding. So thank you very much for having us.
Hi, I'm Claude Aiken, the CEO of the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, better known as WISPA. We are the voice of the fixed wireless industry in the United States, mostly small, mostly rural providers who give consumers who don't have a terrestrial connection their first real connection to the internet and provide competition everywhere. So really excited to be here.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Doug Dimitrov. I'm here representing the New York State Wireless Association, or NISWA. We have WISPA, NISPA, lots of other acronyms. I'm a returning BDAC member and very honored and delighted to be back and working with all of you. Let's get to work. Thanks.
Morning, everybody. I'm Kelly McGriff. I work with Unity Group. Unity Group owns and operates cell phone towers and fiber networks in around 25 states. Very honored to be back on the second iteration of the BDAC. We did a lot of good work in our first time here, and so good to see a lot of good friends and friendly faces, and look forward to meeting all our new folks on the BDAC. Hope we have a good, productive time here. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Rudd, and I'm the Director of Broadband Opportunities for Lieutenant Governor Crouch in the state of Indiana, charged with deploying broadband to every Hoosier across the state with high-speed, reliable, and affordable internet. Quite a daunting task. I look forward to working with each of you, Governor Holcomb and Lieutenant Governor Crouch, in regards to the chairman and the commissioners, and I look forward to working under the chair's leadership and with each and every one of you.
Tom Freeg, CEO of Connected Nation. We're an 18-year national nonprofit. Chairwoman, thank you for hosting us today. My rookie season with the BDAC, so I look forward to hopefully contributing to the discussions, but also learning as much as possible from you all. We represent about 30 states and hundreds of communities across our history that have spanned I guess various areas of expertise, from mapping to policy to local planning to digital inclusion programming. We take a very holistic approach in understanding and identifying solutions. So hope to contribute and learn from this very esteemed group. So thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Chris Nurse, AVP for Government Affairs for AT&T, returning member to the BDAC. I provide government affairs support for our network operations nationwide, principally the CAF2 build-out over 18 states, network disaster and restoration, and of course the small cell deployment and 5G nationwide. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Michael Hain from Nittany Media. I was here last time. Most of you know me. Our company's it's a family business started by my parents 63 years ago. We're providing very rural broadband, and I was just doing the math a little bit ago. I've got 20 years. I used to be the young guy. Don't know what happened, but I have 20 years experience in fixed wireless, 23 in DOCSIS, or from the wireline broadband, and 27 in fiber. And I don't know how that happened. But anyway, I'm very glad to be back here. We have a very diverse group, again, and I think that's a wonderful thing, but I want to make it clear that I'm not here representing necessarily Nittany Media's interests or the cable industry, although I have that perspective. I'm here to take care of the kids that have to go to the library or to McDonald's to do their homework in rural areas. So that's what I'd like to make sure we're clear that we're here about. And again, I'm very glad to be back. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? My name is Tom Ellefson. I'm the SVP of Engineering for T-Mobile here in the Northeast region. This is my first run at BDAC, and certainly looking forward to meeting and working with all of you. A very exciting group of people, obviously. My responsibilities include network engineering, operations and development for T-Mobile in the Northeast, which essentially encompasses the Canadian border down to about South Carolina. So I've got a fairly large group of people that I deal with. Again, first run at BDAC, and looking very much forward to working with all of you.
Good morning. I, too, am a first-timer here. My name is Eve Lewis. I'm an assistant city attorney, in-house counsel of the city of Coconut Creek. We're in South Florida, Broward County. Happy to serve alongside some really important people, so thank you for having me.
I think we have someone who came after we started introductions.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Jim Hyde. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer at Extenet, and serving as an alternate for Mark Ganzi of Digital Bridge. Extenet is a portfolio company of Digital Bridge and the largest private owner and operator of indoor and outdoor distributed networks and small cells in North America. Thank you.
So before we move on, I want to ask if there's anyone on the phone. Okay.
My name is Donald Longknife. I'm with Fort Belknap Indian Community. This is the first time that I'd be sitting on the BDAC Center with you guys, and I sure appreciate it. We are not a telco company or a wireless company, but we are looking at trying to become our own fixed wireless for broadband, because we are still on copper in our area. So I'd like to thank all you guys for allowing me to sit on this board with you guys.
Thank you. Is there anyone else on the phone, or is that all? Okay, so thank you everyone for your introductions. I understand that there are some people who may need to make ethical disclosures at this time. If you do, would you please raise your hand? I think there's 3. Okay, Leticia.
Want to disclose that someone in my household works for Phoenix Tower International.
Thank you. Is that it?
Elizabeth?
Yes.
I made mine during my opening remarks, the 3 companies that I work with.
You got it, okay,
Yep.
thank you. Okay, I thought there were 3, but maybe, okay. Is that it? All right, we're good. All right, thank you very much. So I'm going to pass it back to Justin to do an overview of the BDAC. This is a good reminder for those of us who have been on for a while and for those of us who are new, stuff you need to know about how it works and what we do.
Thank you, Chair. Before I get started, I do want to give our deputy DFOs a quick chance to introduce themselves so that you can get to know them, because I won't be the only person emailing you. They'll also be hassling you via email, so I want to make sure they don't go to spam.
Great. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Zach Ross. I'm an attorney here at the Commission and will be one of your distinguished deputy DFOs. So again, thank you all for volunteering your time and your experience, and really looking forward to working with you all.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Daryl Pei. I am an attorney advisor in the Wireless Telecommunication Bureau's Competition and Infrastructure Policy Division, and together with Zach, I am one of the deputy designated federal officers in this BDAC. And as the chairs a while ago said, we are here to assist you in any way we can, so please let us know how, and just email us whenever you can. Thank you so much for being here today.
All right, thanks, guys. So for those of you who had the honor of serving the first time, this presentation might look a little bit redundant, but we're going to try to go through it reasonably quickly because while it's really exciting stuff, I don't want to keep you too long. So first off, what is the BDAC? The BDAC is actually a federal advisory committee, or a FOC, chartered under the Federal Advisory Committee Act and technology. And so what that means is that we have a number of statutory obligations that we have to comply with for this to be lawful for all of you to come together and to advise the Commission and to put together the recommendations that ultimately you'll be reviewing and voting on in future meetings. As part of the FACA, we have to go with FACA. It's a little bit weird to say the other one. Members are selected to balance out the expertise and viewpoints that are necessary to address effectively the issues that the BDAC is going to consider. So we have, we actually file with the GSA a membership goal plan, and we try to match that as we're going through the applications that you all submitted. The rechartered BDAC was rechartered as of March 1st, 2019. That's for a 2-year term. That'll expire on March 1st, 2021. We can seek another 2-year term if we want to. We can keep this going as long as we want. We'll see if you guys want to serve for like the 7th or 8th BDAC. I will not be. The original charter was of March 1st, 2017, and did expire on March 1st, 2019. So, what is the BDAC's mission? You might have seen this, and it might be a little tricky to see with the closed captioning for those of us in the room, but the BDAC's mission is to make recommendations to the Commission on how to accelerate the deployment of high-speed internet access, broadband, for those who don't know it in the room, by reducing and removing regulatory barriers to infrastructure investment and strengthening existing broadband networks in communities across the country. So what is the BDAC intended to provide? We're looking to provide an effective means, and the Commission's looking for you to provide means for stakeholders with interest in the area to exchange ideas, for you guys to develop recommendations at the Commission on broadband deployment, ultimately which enhances the Commission's job and ability to carry out our statutory responsibilities as far as deploying and encouraging responsibilities to deploy broadband to all Americans. So let's talk about the timeline that our esteemed BDAC members are looking at right now. So today is our first meeting. By the end of June, and hopefully quicker than that, we're going to have the working groups up and running. I've gotten a number of questions from different individuals, kind of what is the status of the working groups. And to give you a big picture overview, the way it works is every BDAC member does serve on one of the 3 working groups. The working groups we'll talk about in a minute, the 3. Additionally, you may have seen public notices that we put out soliciting additional applications for people who may not have wanted to serve on the full BDAC, but who did have an interest in either the low-income working group or the job skills working group. We're in the process of finalizing the ethics review process for those individuals, which, as you may remember, can be a little bit time-consuming. So we have a few more left, but we're hoping to lock that down within the next couple days. Once we do get that locked down, we'll put out a public notice announcing the full membership. Prior to putting out that public notice, I'll notify the chair and vice chair, and then we'll also notify all the members that that public notice is coming out, so you'll be prepared. Once that public notice comes out, the chairs of each individual working group, which we'll talk about in a second, will reach out to all the working group members and set up the working group kind of in the however he or she may seem fit. Once the working groups are set up, we're looking at July, August time period. You guys should start meeting, deciding what you're thinking, how you're going to break down and work your magic into the individual working groups, so that in September 19th and 20th, for our next BDAC meeting, you can come back and be prepared to give us either a kind of status update as to where you are, or to the extent that the working group is incredibly efficient, but maybe potentially recommendations that you might want to present to the full BDAC. It'll depend on how the BDAC is going. After the September 1920 meeting, where the BDAC will discuss the presentations from the different working groups, you'll break back off for the next few months to finalize and get working further on some of those recommendations, or ideally to finalize some recommendations that you may or may not be able to bring to us for our December meeting. The December meeting is going to be on December 2nd and 3rd. Note that both of the September and December will be two-day meetings. We're expecting to have a little bit more substance to go with on top of this inaugural meeting. So please plan accordingly. In that meeting, same thing, the working groups will present updates as to where their status is. We're expecting that at least one of the working groups will probably have some recommendations that they'll be presenting, at which point the BDAC members will discuss and vote on those recommendations. And then we'll go into 2020, and that schedule is just to be determined. There we go. So let's talk about what the working groups are. So the working groups are where all of the magic happens in the BDAC. We'll be meeting here 3 times a year, maybe 4 times next year. But we don't really have the opportunity in these meetings to dive deep and really play out the issues like you need to fulfill the obligations of the BDAC. Instead, the working groups are where you're going to have some time. You'll be working closely with the individuals who are assigned to the working group with you. Each working group should meet frequently. Generally, they meet once a week via teleconference or WebEx. The options of how you meet are kind of up to you, but we expect that sometimes it's even more than that, so that you can get the work done in somewhat of the tight timeframes that the chairman has asked us to ask you to meet. Like I said, each BDAC member is assigned to a working group. You were assigned by the chairman based upon where we thought your talents and expertise and interests fit. And we look forward to hearing and you sharing your expertise through that. Like I said, the working group is going to include other individuals who applied separately, and those people shall be named shortly. All right. What are the working groups? If you haven't seen them yet, the 3 working groups are, first, the Disaster Response and Recovery Working Group. That working group is a carryover from the first BDAC. It began in late 2018 and has been working since. The other 2 are new. The first is the Increasing Broadband Investment in Low-Income Communities Working Group, and the other is the Broadband Infrastructure, Deployment Job Skills, and Training Opportunities Working Group. All righty, it's the first working group, the Disaster Response and Recovery. The chair of that working group is Red Grasso. He's with the North Carolina Department of Information Technology, and the vice chair is Jonathan Adelstein, who's with WIA. Like I said, that was announced in late 2018 in November. It was renewed as part of the BDAC charter renewal on March 1st, 2019. And I'll go on the charters a little bit more depth, but just big picture, this working group is charged with measures to improve resiliency of broadband networks before a disaster occurs, strategies to minimize the downtime of broadband networks, and actions to more quickly restore broadband infrastructure during disaster recovery, as well as developing best practices for coordination among wireless providers, backhaul providers, and power companies during and after a disaster. Now, in your packets of information that's in front of you, we have the working group charges for each of the 3. You'll see that in this PowerPoint, it's a little bit tricky to read. So if you want to follow along this way, you can also look at them on your own time if you want to dive into what the working group charges are. But I'm going to go through them really quick. So the first charge is to take into account different types and sizes of broadband providers to develop recommendations on measures that can be taken before disaster to improve the resiliency of broadband infrastructure. So this working group is going to be looking at identifying processes and procedures that can be adopted at all levels of government to encourage deployment of broadband infrastructure that's resilient in the face of disasters, identifying the existing design and deployment standards that broadband providers can use to make broadband networks more resilient in the face of disasters, identifying best practices for governments and private industry in preparing for the impact of disasters on broadband networks, enhancing the ability of broadband networks and service providers to provide mutual aid during and after a disaster to help ensure that broadband infrastructure benefits from a more effective disaster response and a shorter recovery period, and identifying new data and improving current data gathering on broadband networks to improve emergency response. Additionally, the second charge asks the working group to take into account different types and sizes of broadband providers to develop recommendations focused on minimizing the downtime of broadband networks during disaster response by improving processes and procedures at all levels of government to expedite access to broadband infrastructure sites, including credentialing necessary to restore broadband services, identifying relevant information with respect to broadband networks and sites during the disaster response period, and best practices for sharing relevant information by and among relevant stakeholders, including federal, state, and local governments, and improving procedures to encourage mutual aid and coordination among broadband providers, federal, state, local governments, and utilities. Continuing on, the working groups have been asked to take into account different sizes and types of broadband providers to develop recommendations to restore broadband infrastructure during disaster recovery by streamlining processes and procedures at all levels of government to eliminate barriers to efficient and effective rebuilding of broadband infrastructure and restoration of service, identifying relevant information with respect to broadband networks and services during the disaster recovery period, and best practices for sharing relevant information by and among relevant stakeholders, including federal, state, and local governments, improving procedures to encourage mutual aid and coordination among broadband providers, federal, state, and local governments, and utilities, and developing resiliency targets for rebounding broadband networks, e.g. service levels, resiliency levels. Last, they've been asked to develop best practices for coordination among wireless providers, backhaul providers, and power companies, as said before. All right, so that's our first working group. Our newest working group, one of the two new working groups, is the Increasing Broadband Investment in Low-Income Communities Working Group. This is going to be chaired by Tom Free from Connected Nation, whom we just heard from, vice chair being Claude Aiken from WISPA. This working group will hit the ground shortly, and we're looking forward to what they're going to offer us. Big picture goal for this working group, we're looking for them to provide advice and recommendations to the Commission on new ways to encourage the deployment of high-speed broadband infrastructure and services to low-income communities. More specifically, the chairman has asked this working group to develop recommendations for the Commission on new ways to encourage broadband deployment of high-speed broadband infrastructure and services, including at least 25 up and 3 down, 25 down, 3 up, fixed and high-quality mobile broadband service to low-income communities. In developing recommendations on this topic, the working group should specifically identify regulatory and other barriers that deter the deployment of high-speed broadband infrastructure and services to low-income communities, recommend actions that Commission should take to consider taking to increase incentives to invest and deploy high-speed broadband to low-income communities, identify barriers to adoption and use of high-speed broadband services in low-income communities, recommend actions the Commission should consider taking to increase broadband adoption and use among low-income Americans, examine whether greater broadband adoption rates among low-income Americans would give providers stronger incentives to deploy more broadband infrastructure to low-income communities, to recommend best practices for states and localities to encourage deployment of high-speed broadband to low-income communities and to encourage broadband adoption within such communities, and to explain and examine how the Commission should identify low-income areas where additional action or reform would most increase broadband deployment. Additionally, the Commission has asked this working group to consider and address different actions and challenges facing urban areas and rural areas. For example, are there actions that the Commission should consider taking that are better suited to encourage broadband deployment to low-income communities and rural areas as compared to urban areas? The working group should focus on both deployment of services to low-income communities that do not presently have high-speed broadband services available, and the deployment of additional facilities-based competitive options. We do want to note specifically that these charges do not include the consideration of changes to the Commission's Universal Service Fund, and that is solely the province of the Federal State Joint Board on Universal Service. So this is a somewhat limited working group to the specific charges we just gave you. All right, last, but definitely not least, is our new working group on broadband infrastructure deployment, job skills, and training opportunities. This is going to be chaired by Leticia Latino and Rick and Thacker. Big picture, we're looking for this working group to provide advice and recommendations to the Commission and other stakeholders on ways to make more widely available and improve job skills training and development opportunities for the broadband infrastructure deployment workforce. And more specifically, the Commission is asking this working group to develop recommendations to make more widely available and improve job skills training and development opportunities for the broadband infrastructure workforce. The group should specifically identify any gaps in broadband infrastructure deployment skills that could inhibit the pace of deployment of fixed and mobile broadband connectivity across the nation. For each issue identified, to formulate possible solutions that stakeholders could implement. Proposed solutions, to the extent possible, should be adaptable and scalable to different deployment areas and technologies to encourage widespread adoption. The working group should recommend possible steps that stakeholders can take to attract more skilled professionals to join the broadband infrastructure deployment workforce, and identify any existing job skills and training programs that could serve as a model for stakeholders and deployment measures to bridge any skill gaps in broadband infrastructure deployment. It should also recommend possible performance metrics to gauge the effectiveness of existing and future job skills and training programs, and develop steps that can be taken to continually improve the effectiveness of such programs. And last, the working group should consider and address different challenges facing rural and urban areas. How can all parties help ensure that there are enough skilled workers to deploy broadband in both rural and urban areas? To the extent possible, the working group's recommendation should be in the form of concrete steps and procedures that the Commission and other stakeholders could adopt. The working group's recommendations will aid the Commission's effort to encourage the deployment of high-speed broadband to all Americans. So that's what we're looking at for the working groups and a big picture from the BDAC. We're going to have a presentation slightly later about some of the FACA requirements that you'll all be expected to comply with from our Office of General Counsel. So get excited for that. I promise it's more exciting than this one. If anyone has any questions, you all should know how to reach out to me. I've been emailing you a couple times reminding you to attend this meeting, but please don't hesitate. I've put up our contact information for Daryl, Zach, and myself. We are very responsive, and we'll do the best we can to answer any questions if anything pops up.
Thank you. So we are way ahead of time, which is really great. But on the downside, we will not have the ability to get our FACA overview, which I know we are all very much looking forward to, until 11:30, and I don't really want to take an hour. So I would like to ask if the Disaster Response and Recovery presentation group, if you all can move up your presentation. Is Red here? I didn't. Red. Yay. Okay. So I'll tee up. I think you can come over here. So with that, I'd like to introduce Red Grasso and the Disaster Response and Recovery Working Group. This working group, as Justin mentioned, started their work back in November, and they've been working diligently, so we actually have a full report from them this morning. Red and Jonathan Edelstein will begin, and then we will add Kurt Jacobs, who is the lead for the subgroup on infrastructure standards and resiliency, as well as Peter Tomczak, lead subgroup on mutual aid, resource sharing, and coordination. What I would like to ask is, Red, I'd like to go for about an hour and then take a break at 11:30, if we can do that.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm going to move that.
Why? It's so nice. You put.
It's wonderful. I just don't want any confusion about what my role is or
Here you go, sir.
Oh, look at that. Excellent. So we have a slide deck. I don't know. Look at that. How about that? Right on cue. The other thing that we have for you is we do have a handout that was kind of part of the paperwork there. What we tried to do was we tried to have the handout be very wordy and our slides are a little less so. so that we're not asked to take our eye test today and read from the chart. Just a quick introduction. My name is Red Grasso. I do work for the state of North Carolina. My background was actually 10 years as a firefighter. And then in a desire to stay married, I moved to St. Louis and ended up on the technology side of things, helping launch P25 public safety land mobile radio system. So kind of getting into the technology world, and now I work for the state of North Carolina in the Department of Information Technology, still focused on our first responders. So obviously, disaster response and recovery becomes extremely important. I am joined by Jonathan as vice chair, who I lean on very much for a lot of advice and some of the actual content of our working and leadership there. Jonathan, did you want to do an intro?
Sure, I can just say a few words real quick.
Sure, that'd be great.
And Red, thank you for that. Thank you for the great work you've been doing as chair of this. This committee has done a tremendous amount of good work in a very short period of time. And I want to thank you and the working group chairs. We split into 3 subgroups, and we're going to hear from, not everybody is able to be here today, but we're going to hear from the work of all the subgroups today. This issue is of tremendous importance. We say that about a lot of things in Washington, but this is literally a matter of life and death. I'm in awe of my colleagues on this working group that are in public safety, that put themselves on the line every day for all of us in this country. And we, as the industry, are honored to work with them to make sure that we meet the needs that they have. And ultimately, to meet the needs of our customers, because when you think about it, our customers are virtually everybody in this country. And when there is a disaster is when they rely on our networks more than anything else. That's when we as the wireless industry demonstrate our highest value. And as the telecommunications providers here understand, we want to meet those needs at like no other time. And yet those are when the challenges are the greatest for the industry, they're the greatest for public safety, they're the greatest for our customers. So this working group trying to determine how we can meet those needs when our people need it the most is really of, I think, a profound importance and one of the most important things we can imagine doing here in Washington. So I'm honored to serve with you, Red, and with all the members of this group to try to get this critical work done, get it done quickly, and get it done right, so we can respond to all these disasters quickly, effectively, and recover as quickly as possible.
Excellent, thank you. So I do want to highlight our members on our, there we go. We do have several members of the BDAC that participate in our working group, and then as is typical for the working groups of the BDACs, we also have several people who are not on the full BDAC committee that are really diving in and doing this important work. I want to acknowledge each of them. Andrew Afflerbach. It's funny because we didn't pay attention to our closed captioning, so I'll just go through the names here. Alan Bell joins us. Megan Bixler, Skylar Ditchfield, and also represented by his alternate, Melissa, who's with us. Rob Cantu, Tony Fisher, Monica Gambino, Larry Hansen is with us, David Hartshorn, Greg Hauser, Kurt Jacobs, Kent Kildow, Frank Cornick, Wyatt Leahy, David Marshak, Jim Matheson, who's also represented by his alternate often, Kelly McGriff, Alexander Fernandez Navarro, John O'Connor, Eddie Reyes, Rick and Thacker, Pete Tomzek, Rocky Vaz, Joe Vines, and Sanjay Sagiri. I will admit to you that there is a little bit of a Where's Waldo. There's one typo in your handout versus the other thing. So if you find it, you can come to me afterwards and I'll hand you the award for attention to detail, which clearly I don't have. So that'll be one project for you in your work there. I do want to call out, though, we do have a couple of members of our working group here in the audience. If you are a member of our working group or an alternate, would you stand up and just be recognized? We've got we tried to fill the room, but we've got several people here with us, and I want to thank them not only for their attendance today, but also for their work on the group. I know several other members weren't able to make the trip to DC, but are probably watching us live. So if I seem a little bit nervous, it's because I feel like I'm on the spot. My mom may also be watching, so that becomes something to kind of pay attention to. So as Jonathan mentioned, we did split up into subgroups. When we looked at our charges, the charges were really delivered to us in terms of kind of an emergency management phase, before disaster, during the disaster, and then post-disaster. And then we have one charge that kind of spans them all in terms of coordination and mutual aid. And what we looked at was to really dive in and dig deep into our working group, that it was best for us to kind of split out by taking those charges and look at government processes and procedures. That is our subgroup A and is led by Sanjay Sagiri. Our infrastructure standards and resiliency, which is our subgroup B, and that is led by Kurt Jacobs. And then our mutual aid and coordination is Pete Tomzak. And one of the things that you'll see in our handout, we kind of lay out the missions and charges. We duplicate some of the information that you've already been presented this morning. But there's a color chart on there, and what we've got is it's pretty fine print, so if anybody needs a magnifying glass, you may need to break that out. But it really kind of shows you how we split up into our 3 working groups with regard to the charges that are there, so that we had some focus for our subgroups to really kind of identify that. And really what we'd like to do after going through our organization part of it, is we'd like to kind of present based on those subgroups. And really the important part of today is to engage in dialogue with the full BDAC and get your thoughts, your comments, your input as we are, in some sense, coming out of the first phase of our working group. This first phase, since we formed back in late 2018, was really the information gathering. And so each subgroup has done a tremendous job of looking at the current state of things, looking at information that's available today, and really gathering with not only written documentation, but also presentations to our working group and our subgroups. And so we're almost kind of going into our next phase now, which then becomes, okay, here's the current state of things, here's what we found so far, now what? And I think it's important to have a dialogue with the BDAC and kind of get your thoughts on the now what portion of it. Unfortunately, Sanjay was not able to join us today, so I'm going to step in and present on behalf of Sanjay for subgroup A. I'll go ahead and ask Kurt Jacobs to come up and join us. Did he have a table tent as well, I think?
We're going to do this during the break.
Right? We'll put everybody on the spot. Kurt, thank you so much. Thank you. This is Kurt. You want to follow him on Twitter or Facebook? How you spell his name. So we'll dive right in, and we'll make sure my next slide is appropriate. I have to let Face ID do its thing. Very good. So again, what we tried to do is we just tried to keep these slides pretty basic, but there's more detailed information in your handout, and I think part of that detailed information gets into some more of the written portions for each subgroup. So really what we want to present to you today is sort of what the research has been, some of the sources that the subgroups have identified, and then we asked the subgroups, and we actually had a working session yesterday within the entire working group to identify the biggest challenges that they may see. And really our hope is that kind of 2 or 3 bullet points per subgroup will lead to the conversation. I will admit, as I did yesterday, that part of my background comes from television broadcast, so sometimes dead air is an uncomfortable silence to me, so I end up just kind of rambling through. So I think it's probably fair to say that the working group members know that you can't be shy, that if you've got something to add, be sure to cut me off, because I can kind of roll through it. So in subgroup A, the research really has been just a collections of lessons learned among all of the subgroup members and their contacts. As you can imagine, that government processes and procedures can really kind of vary. There's an old saying that if you've ever been to a fire station in the United States, you've been to one fire station in the United States. And I think that that's true with a lot of our industries, with a lot of our organizations, and certainly true about our governments. That if you understand how one local government works, you understand how one local government works. And as we've kind of dug into some of the processes and procedures, there is a lot of information out there. There's a lot of differences out there. Some of the sources have included presentations on Hurricanes Irma and Maria's response and recovery efforts in Puerto Rico. We had a presentation from the California Public Utilities Commission, report on some of the wildland fires, and we even have an upcoming presentation from Hawaii, from their statewide interoperability coordinator on the response to some of the volcanic activity that occasionally takes place in our volcano islands. As you see up there, the bullet point for challenges is how to align better alignment from private and multi-jurisdictional governmental entities. It's no secret that in some sense, the way that our private industries operate is vastly different than government. The kind of mission and scope becomes different. The ability to share information among private sectors can sometimes be challenging because they have interests to protect. An example of this is Puerto Rico's private sector did go through quite an interesting response to the disasters there. They were able to sign NDAs in order to share fiber, fuel resources, and roaming agreements to cooperatively restore communications on that island after disasters. I'm going to go ahead and go into the second bullet, and then I'm going to pause because the intent here is that we do make time for discussion on this, and we'll go through kind of each subgroup. You may see some overlap, but it's really the dialogue that's the most important. The second one really addresses the need to holistically approach the interdependency between connectivity and energy supplies. And it was a great discussion yesterday. I think part of it is to recognize that energy supplies is really all-encompassing, whether that means the end user who failed to charge up their devices and may not have alternate sources of charging that end user device. That can lead to just as much of a disconnection for the citizens as generators that failure to have fuel, for commercial power that may be suffering its own effects from the disaster, and some of the other kind of supply issues that we have. And of course, again, not to pick on any one area, but some of the examples in subgroup B has been the effects with Puerto Rico and how they were able to have a waiver for generators to provide power, to get generators in from the Dominican Republic, where typically that may not be something that's done in terms of some of the regulations and some of the practices that are out there. I am honored to be joined by some of our working group members, both on the BDAC as well as in the audience, and I think I would like to give time for a discussion on this portion of the work that's been done so far and open it up to the BDAC.
Any questions or comments? Kelly.
So I have two higher level questions about
Please.
the committee. One thing I failed to mention in my introduction is UETN is also a public broadcaster. Are you working with public broadcast at all with HTSC 3.0, the new broadcast standard that will help do some notifications for disaster? Is that within the purview of this group? And also, what's the role of FirstNet in this discussion?
Excellent, good questions. So, I mean, I can tell you part of my daily job is actually an advocate for ATSC 3.0. We're looking in the state of North Carolina, as well as I know around the country. APTS has been doing a lot of great work to advocate for the next digital TV standard. So I know that it's part of what I bring to the table to kind of look at that and look at some of the evolving technologies, and some of that gets into some of what Subgroup B has been looking at. It is part of our discussion, and I think it's an important part of our discussion. FirstNet really represents, in some sense, a great catalyst to an existing technology. And FirstNet is represented on our board, Pete Tomczak on our working group. Pete Tomczak does work full-time for the FirstNet Authority, and it has been part of the conversations there as well.
Thanks. Any other questions or comments?
I think one of the questions that I would have is, what is your input to, as we look at what these challenges are, specifically for Subgroup A at this time, what is your input to maybe where we could help focus, or where some of this kind of goes for our working group at the committee level? So I don't know if we can
Before we move on,
please.
One thing, I know that some people who are here may also have questions for the working group who are in the audience. We're going to hold those until the end, so if you would make a note of your questions, we will have time after the report.
Okay, great. And I think one of the questions I would have then is, we do have some working group members in the audience. Would it be fair for them to contribute to the discussion?
Yes, if you would like them to.
Okay, very good. Please, Ken.
Yeah, thanks. With regard to your challenge about the government approaching more holistically this interdependency between connectivity and just available energy suppliers, one thing I would encourage the committee to do, which I know goes beyond what your charge is, but something just to keep in mind from a matter of perspective, is that really is an increasingly important issue with regard to deployment as well as response and recovery. We dealt with some of those issues in the first BDAC in the competitive access working group, but it continues to be a very significant issue just in terms of creating better coordination between telecommunication service providers and the energy industry, and making sure that there's good coordination, again, with regard to deployment, operations, and in the context of response and recovery. And so I would encourage the working group to keep that perspective in mind as they go forward. And frankly, that may be an issue we talk about more broadly if we can figure out another place to put that.
Yeah, and so if I can summarize, I think part of what I hear then is that coordination on the deployment side, right? Early on, we're not just talking about sort of preparation for a disaster or response or recovery, but also just the fact that when it gets deployed, that there is a level of coordination there to identify those dependencies.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. One of the gating items that's being increasingly encountered in connection with deployment is something as simple as just having power readily available in order to be provided for deployment of assets. And there are different experiences depending on which utilities you're dealing with in terms of the availability of those power resources. But it can certainly be a very serious challenge and can delay the actual deployment efforts quite a bit.
Indeed.
Red?
Scott?
Yeah. Agricultural, can you hear me? Am I on?
Sort of.
Am I on? Agriculture is very important in the state of Indiana, and had the privilege of touring an agricultural operation recently that depends on remote access to control fans and temperatures in an egg production facility. And it became clear to me that during a disaster, it could become vitally important for that manager of the operation to be able to access temperature controls at those types of facilities to protect our food source. And so wondering if something like a FirstNet could be explored for critical agricultural operations to help protect our food source.
Yeah, and again, I'm kind of taking notes as well so that we make sure we bring all this great information back to the working group. So I just want to summarize that some of this, in sense, is recognition of our food source as a critical infrastructure and making sure that that sort of gets addressed in terms of a response and recovery. Did you, Kurt?
Yeah, I'll just add that when we get to subgroup B, we are looking at that because we're seeing the increased dependency on other lifeline functions on the infrastructure, and that's a big part of what we're looking at. Of not only how we've reacted and improved from the last way things were done, but how we need to be prepared for the future.
Jonathan.
Yeah, just to respond to that point, and Ken's point, one of the issues we're looking at is resiliency, and Kurt's group's done a great job of looking at that. One of the keys to resiliency is redundancy. So basically, as we get these networks distributed deeper and deeper into communities, there are more opportunities for recovery and resiliency. So we've been focused a lot on the power supply issue, in fact, because it's probably the most fundamental issue to recovery for telecommunications networks after a disaster. And I think it's a good idea to look at it holistically from the entire life cycle, from the beginning, getting it deployed, creating that resiliency, and then ensuring that that power can be restored as quickly as possible, or that it can be maintained through all kinds of backup systems that are carefully thought through. And we're trying to remove also obstacles to the deployment of backup power as we look at this broader issue. I think it's very fundamental to the work we're doing.
Let's take Alan, and then we'll go back to your report and have more questions later if we need.
I know one of the things that came out of the Hurricane Michael discussion was the role of the emergency operating centers and how priorities can be set on that. And I know in Georgia, we were affected by Michael, and it was peanut harvesting time, and so that was a priority in the emergency operating center as set by the governor in how at least power was restoring their service. And so I think everybody across the board has talked about the importance of the emergency operating centers and how a lot of communication can take place in that. And maybe, and this isn't just the communication industry, the electric industry probably isn't participating or supporting that group as much as they should. And I think it was very clear in all the comments I saw that that's something that needs to improve, because those type priorities can be addressed there, because every storm is different. There's no plan we can put together that's going to cover everything.
Sorry, I didn't see Leticia's thing.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. As one of the companies that usually gets called after a disaster, be it an earthquake or a hurricane, one of the things that comes to mind is how the government is benefiting from all the new technologies that are out there on the field, and how can we leverage those technologies to make the planning process stronger? Because our feel is that when there's information available, we're entering the world of virtual reality, augmented reality, yet you need to inspect the site and you need to send someone. And there are technologies out there, so I think it's important for this working group, and maybe you've touched upon, because I know Kurt and I know he's onto it, but to how do we incorporate technologies that will make the government stronger in the quest for resilience?
Yeah, excellent. And I think part of what you had said that I wrote down is the new technology in that planning process, not just the response process. So that's something we'll bring back to the working group. One clarification that I want to make is that our working group, early on, we did discuss, disasters, and it was sort of like, well, which one? We are looking at this in terms of sort of an emergency management term of an all hazards. We're not just focused. We have had some presentations, obviously, on our disaster du jours, but we are looking at the effects of connectivity with regard to earthquake, wildfires, flooding, windstorms, really sort of anything that may affect our citizens' ability to stay connected and maintain their communications that they need and our responders. With that, let's go on to subgroup B. And have Kurt
Red,
present.
we have one more. Doug.
Oh, apologize about that.
Yeah, thank you, sorry. Just a quick question to that last point. In terms of the disaster description or definition of what is incorporated, is the working group also looking at other than natural disasters or man-made disasters, issues that come up that aren't caused by Mother Nature?
I think we have had discussions about, there's a lot of our disaster recovery conversations have been about issues that affect sort of physical infrastructure. There is a conversation about maybe a cybersecurity disaster, right? Something that doesn't necessarily affect it. It's not wind, it's not rain, it's not the fire, it's not infrastructure that has been destroyed or moved or non-existent, but that cybersecurity threat that occurs, and how do we maintain that? That one can be a much meatier topic because it's not as easy to just kind of say, well, we'll just put a different tower, we'll just get a different energy source, we'll just do this differently. It becomes a much more interesting. So I mean, part of it is to hear from the BDAC on is there any direction or is there any focus that needs to be paid special attention to that versus some of the other disasters that we're trying to look at?
Yeah, and I guess just to clarify, you mentioned one, cybersecurity is one example, but another, frankly, is I think what caused this group in some respects to be formed early on was 9/11. Ultimately I think this is part of what, it resulted from that disaster. So I just highlight that as an example of something else to keep in mind, that it may not be a natural disaster that might be the cause of a need for disaster recovery.
Excellent, thank you.
Michael.
Oh.
Red, as you alluded, every community is different. In our rural and local areas, the emergency responders all know each other pretty well. I mean, we not only have personal contact information, cell phones, but if somebody needed something, they could knock on my door. I mean, that's the level with that. But in the larger communities, I think we need some sort of a credentialing program. I'm sure you've looked at that. Is that correct? To make sure that we know who's supposed to be where?
Yep, we have had a conversation about, even some of it is access, right? Being able to see what kind of access control is in place when we talk about responding to these disasters and recovery efforts, that if roadways are limited, how do we make sure that the private industry that is coming in to help restore and respond to it is given the access that they need when a governmental entity has kind of said, look, we're going to restrict access because we don't want to flood that sort of area. So that is part of the purview of how we're looking at this.
So when the governor closes the roads, we can still get out to put the wires back up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's our hope, and that is what we're looking at. We're not exactly directing the 50 governors on make sure you do this, but that is part of our conversation.
Thank you.
Just make sure they include the contractors, like your logistics contractors, along with the primary providers. I mean, the power company has their tree trimming contractors, which are as important as the linemen. We have fuel delivery logistics suppliers as well as the technicians, that sort of thing.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that, kind of broadly, we've wrapped that in what we kind of call those dependencies.
Right.
That if you can't get to the power line because the tree is down, well, that tree becomes the more important thing. So having all of that as a part of our discussion.
Karen.
Thank you. Red, thank you for your presentation this morning. So the question that I have, so in areas where the natural disaster or the disaster occurs, there may be broadband there, but there may be a certain area that's underserved. is there any thought to, when you're restoring service, ensuring to increase the service to that particular area?
Well, I can say from a chair perspective, that is part of the conversation that needs to be there. And as we get together as a working group, as you know, right now we're at that subgroup level where we're really doing the information gathering on these very focused areas. I think that it is an important conversation for our working group to have, so that when we bring something up to the greater BDAC, where deployment is not part of our charges, but it is part of yours,
right,
as a committee. So I think whatever we bring forward in terms of response and recovery to disasters, I think that it is a great way to tie into a response to a disaster could lead to better served and increasing that deployment.
Let's move on to the rest of your report.
Yes, indeed. Kurt, subgroup B. I think I queued that up already. Perfect.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kurt Jacobs with JMA Wireless. If you don't know JMA Wireless, we're a U.S. company that makes 4G, 5G equipment, technology that sits mostly on the edge of the network. Almost everyone here is connected through it. You just didn't know it. We sell through the carriers and neutral hosts and so forth. I work with our alliances and ecosystem for JMA, so I have the advantage of also looking 2 to 5 years out, what's going on, and also recovering Navy reservists that spent 7 years in disaster response and homeland security, which gives me a little perspective. Would like to thank the FCC in that when they pick the membership for this working group, not only did we get from different sectors, we also got people with experience at different levels from the response, and that has been invaluable. Not just have a high-level people, but have people like Red that are firefighters and so forth. That is really important because all disasters, like politics, really happen locally, and then they build up from there. So that's been important. So subgroup B, we focused on looking at the infrastructure standards and resiliency and how what the best practices are, what information sharing should be, and then what some of the resiliency targets and how we measure how we're doing. The research we've done to date has really been in 3 kind of buckets. One, we looked historically at recent events. We did all hazards as much as we could. There's more to do there. We looked at previous FCC reports, the work of the CISRIC, work of other industry groups, the DoD smart grid trials and results. So we kind of cast a very wide net, and we certainly discovered that there isn't a net big enough to capture all of the activity and lessons learned and report out there. So hopefully we've done enough to get a good sense of that. And we discovered there's no 2 events that are alike. There's a very good process of capturing this, and all the organizations and groups out there are working really hard. Nobody's ignoring the area of best practices and standards, updating and evolving. But they may not always be relevant to the next one. That is one of the things that we're finding. We looked at the current standards and best practices and the current state of the industry. They're from a whole bevy, and it's in your handout in detail what we looked at, including government policy and trade groups. And then we also kind of stumbled and spent some time into really looking at the future of what kind of changes are pending with the FCC in terms of spectrum, what's changing in terms of technology with shared spectrum like CBRS, what's happening with 5G, and how the technology is changing, and how people are using the network differently as well. To get to the point earlier about now agriculture is depending more on connectivity. We're getting more connected, and what we're finding is while the technology is getting better and the best practices and standards are getting better, The demand, so if you think of it as kind of a scale, we used to have a pound on each side, and if things shifted, it wasn't, it was recoverable. Now we're putting 100 pounds on each side of the scale. So when things go bad, it's a bigger impact. So that's the activity that we gathered and brought forward from a variety of sources. And our big challenges that we see is there are so many standards and practices, it's almost impossible for anyone to completely digest that, especially down at a local level to understand, and as the technology is changing. So we're looking at how we can recommend industry and different technologies to be consolidated, converged, and brought forward. And we see things that are happening, like with the National Response Framework, the new ESF 14, which is being proposed and is open for comment now, where they're opening more cross-industry function and communication as an enabler for that. That'll be important for this. We also see that that as the telecom and the IT and the broadband industry kind of converges more, that there needs to maybe promote the industry to reconcile some of those standards and best practices so the terminology is the same between the different groups as we move forward. Because the central office is becoming the data center, and the data center is becoming the central office. To make sure that we're not leaving anything behind that we learned from the past. The network evolution is also causing more complexity. There's some good news in that there's more spectrum diversity. There's more options for people to connect. Our means of connectivity is getting more automatic. Things like CBRS shared spectrum that there will be interoperability with, and new providers can provide access. The integration with Wi-Fi and cellular connectivity, and things like dedicated spectrum for utilities or critical infrastructure, to a point earlier about providing that diversity of connectivity. But we also could be creating new points of, I'll call hidden convergence, where we think we have separate infrastructure, but then we find out there's critical nodes or single points of failure in the system that we didn't realize. Because these networks are changing, and there's a lot more players that are part of the ecosystem of the technology, we have to make sure all those different new players, I think of rural connectivity, there's going to be a lot more companies out there that have to know resiliency and standards and best practices as well as the big guys. So that's something that we've highlighted. Our one area that's really been a struggle for us in this working group is resiliency targets and metrics. The challenge there is one. I used to be working in the nuclear power industry a long time ago. The big events don't happen enough, and they're all different, that it's tough to get good metrics to measure that, and every disaster is different. And our current systems are not necessarily real time. We do see some promise in some of the new technologies for things like CBRS, where there's a spectrum manager that in real time can display without individual company data being revealed to actually see where there's connectivity and not connectivity, without having to distract people who are trying to respond to the disaster, to fill out reports that end up being time late anyway. So we're looking at things of how we can not just do the way we've been doing things better, but leap forward and make recommendations of how things we can promote that kind of leapfrog those current ways of doing business. But resiliency targets is something we definitely have to roll up our sleeves and do a little bit more to meet that charge. So with that, pending your questions.
I think one clarification I just want to make in terms of our organization, our membership, geez, I'd have to count real quick. It's 20 plus, and though we organize by subgroup to give us some focus on which conference call you're dialing into and such, our working group as a whole has been doing every 2 weeks we have a conference call, and then the subgroups have been doing their work usually in the alternating weeks, even at times going each week to try and dig into this rich topic. And our members are often a part of multiple of the subgroups. So we have a number of different people who are gluttons for punishment. And we do have quite a number of cross between all of our subgroups, which leads to a pretty rich discussion at the working group level. And I just wanted to make that clarification as well.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any questions to that report? Do we want, what's the feeling of the room? Do you want to take a break now for 10 minutes, or do you want to hear the last part of your report? I don't know how long it's going to be. Why don't we take a 10-minute break now and come back at 11:15? If we can get started, if everyone would still take their seat, please take their seats. Turn up my mic, you. All right. My methodology is if they turn my mic live, I start calling people out by name. Like, okay, stop talking, Jonathan. Okay, Kelly, sit down. I'm trying. I was gavelled a minute ago. Yo. Kelly McGriff, do not leave that room. Okay, you may go.
Recognize David or something.
The one person I will give a total brief to.
You only have to make it, do it for one.
He's not able to, so I'm going to take Pete's. Yeah, indeed, thank you.
Every time I see myself on that stupid camera, I think, oh, I should have done my hair. What was I thinking? Of course, I don't have my vice chair. Alan Bell, I'm calling you out. Ken Simon. No. David Don, not in earshot. Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. I think folks will trickle back in, but I do want to say on schedule. So, Red.
Very good. So where we left it was we had the kind of status update from our subgroup B. Unfortunately, Pete Tomczak's not able to join us for subgroup C, so you'll have to drone with my voice for subgroup C. I'll give you the status update there, and then again open it up for the all-important input and dialogue. Subgroup C is really looking at sort of the coordination. It's referred to as the mutual aid, resource sharing, and coordination, which becomes so important regardless of what side of the fence, public, private industry, partners, that part of it really looks at the current state of what's out there. The research has come from best practices and recommendations in the area of disaster preparation, response, and recovery for the communications industry, power companies, government entities, and others that are responding. The sources have included the FCC, ADIS, CTIA, NIST, as well as others. I love throwing out acronyms if you don't know them. One of my favorite acronyms is a GOAT, which is the glossary of acronyms and terms. The fact that it has an acronym just makes me laugh. So we can dig into those acronyms if anybody needs a refresher for those. But just getting right into the biggest challenges is that there is a wealth of resources, and I want to call out that in terms of subgroup C, the kind of coordination piece versus subgroup B with the industry and standards, this bullet point may seem redundant, but it really has a different focus. There are a wealth of standards, right? That's the great thing about standards, there's so many to choose from. But on this side of thing, the wealth of resources comes from sort of the best practices on how either companies are responding or our civilians, our customers are reacting to those disasters. And again, what we find is such a rich body from so many different sources that the working group is challenged to look at it and say, okay, how do we distill all of that out and make it into something that's going to be very digestible for the BDAC. And that's one of the challenges that we have and are standing up to accept. The other bullet point there is the need to educate and inform local governments about those dependencies. So we kind of talked about the dependencies that are there, as well as the processes for coordination with response agencies and entities that are responding. So again, just this idea that in terms of response, in some sense, we can write it all down and it's words on a piece of paper, but it becomes sort of, advice is very easy to give, it's hard to take. And so how do we really educate and inform not only the industries, not only the governments, but in some sense also the public, that there is this need for education and information to be made readily available, which will add to our resiliency, because in some sense, in a lot of sense, we can't stop these disasters from happening. We can just make our communities more resilient. We can make our networks with backups. We can kind of look at this hopefully holistically and make sure that we can sort of maintain the connectivity that we have. That's sort of the status update for C. So that says reaction and additional discussion underneath our subtitling there. And that really kind of brings us again to the important part of our discussion here at the committee level and see what kind of input you all have to the work that we've been doing so far. Any sort of focuses. Again, I'm taking notes. We're going to bring this back to the group, and so I think at this time, not only C, but also in general, any of the stuff we've talked about with government policies and procedures, with industry, and with mutual aid, any sort of input. And I guess it would be kind of appropriate just to recognize the new members that your table tent up means that you have a question or comment.
So before we get to questions or comments, I just want to note that we are expecting the Office of General Counsel, and she's not here right now, so we can go ahead, but we may have to interrupt when she arrives.
Very good. I remain rigidly flexible.
It's a good place to be.
Indeed.
All right. Any questions or thoughts? I know you had one from last time.
I'll share.
Thank you. I think a couple of things. The definition of disaster, and how are we defining that? As a member of the last committee, we all know the definitions are very important. And then really a discussion around, we've been talking generally about private networks and the resiliency of private networks, but many of our members operate institutional networks that connect fire stations and police stations and 911 centers. Are we going to look at that as part of the recommendations for disaster recovery? And I think those are separate yet equally important set of infrastructure to look at. And then SCADA networks for water, sewer, Allen's power companies that got to keep Allen on. So I think those are also very interesting challenges, not just providing service to retail customers.
Excellent. I wrote that down. So.
Not for Allen. Don't call Allen.
I am happy to call Alan.
Alan.
We had a discussion about, the smart grid and the fact that, the electric industry is moving toward the grid operating itself, and that involves communication significantly. And the definition of disaster is important, because on a day like today, when there is no disaster and a truck takes out a pole, the system heals itself, isolates it to that area, and we can get that area fixed with a minimal use. But when there's a disaster, depending on what kind of disaster it is, we're not as dependent on communication operator network, because the device that connects the communication may not be there. So, and then we also get thousands of people to support, so we've got somebody on every switch if we need to operate them. So there's not a direct correlation with communication and restoration during a disaster for us, but it is an essential part of operating our network, and we want to get back as soon as we can to what normal is. So that was one thing we did address, and I wanted to cover at this point, because it's a reasonable assumption that if we're becoming more and more dependent on communication, don't you need the communication done first before you get your power back? And it's not necessarily that way.
So to build on your comment, with the recent flooding that we've had in the Midwest, a lot of pump stations for wastewater and stormwater systems are operated remotely now. With Brian's group, some of these are great distances, and when we partner together with rural co-ops to provide that connectivity, so we may have power at the pump station, but we have no connectivity to operate it. So when you're looking at this as a group, having that conversation around institutional networks, SCADA networks is really important, just as important, we feel, as commercial networks. So, yeah.
Tim.
Just to build on David's comment earlier around the definition of disaster, it feels like from the readouts from the three user groups, this feels a lot of focus around the physical network and disasters specifically around weather or flooding or those types of things. Is the scope including logical communication, continuity issues, cybersecurity, those types of things, denial of service, or is it strictly focused on weather-related, natural disaster type of activity? How do I think about the scope and kind of separate or include physical, logical, cyber, et cetera? How do I think about that?
Yeah, pure cyber, we have not put a big focus on, to be honest. We can do that. I think that we should reconcile that to CISRIC is very much focused on that, and they have charges there, so we were kind of a little careful to stay out of their lane. But if we need to expand into that area, we can, and then we probably need to coordinate there. But we have looked at the all hazards, which would include man-made, natural, but just kind of traditionally in the way these have been looked at, they've always separated cyber because, one, you can get into, security, classification issues and things like that, I think that we might end up being a little redundant to what's going on there, but I mean, from our perspective, we're open to do that, but that is, that definitely is expanding the scope.
So the cyber issues come up several times. I think there's a sense, I guess I'd like to get the sense of folks, but it is a little bit different for this body than maybe what others are addressing, because we would really be addressing what do you do to recover from such a thing, more so than how do you prevent such a thing from happening in the first place. And I don't know how much that's being addressed, but I think what I would like to do is take that back and see whether it's within the scope or where that would fit, or whether it's even something that this body should be addressing at this point in time. So let's take that back, and we'll talk about it and come back next time with an answer.
Great.
Okay, any other comments or thoughts? Well, I would just like to say, fantastic work. This is really a lot of effort. I recognize how complicated this issue is, and I think you all have done an amazing job getting it to this point, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the work that comes out of your working group.
Great. If I can just close by one, acknowledging all of the work of the members. It is a lot. It's a lot to kind of volunteer at least a week conference call every week as other duties as assigned, and some may have been voluntold or not. And I do also want to recognize that the work that the BDAC is doing, the work that the working group members are doing, it's really great to be able to pull together people that are really looking strategic, that they're looking this far out at what kinds of recommendations, what things can be done for the future. And I think that it's great to see that our organizations allow us to take the time to do that. And my last plea is to really engage with other organizations to allow so. I think that I can really only speak from the public sector. I can really only speak for my organization, and very thankful that my organization allows me the time to think strategically and to participate in these things. And I think that the more organizations that value that, then the more voices we can get to the table to be heard, to make sure that everything that becomes very meaningful, because it's encompassing of all of the different perspectives from private, from public, from vendor, from local government, state government, from all of those perspectives. So it's just a plea that that if you're a manager in an organization, to allow your employees to think strategically and participate in important efforts like this one.
Jonathan.
Just a reminder, we were going to open this up at the end to the public or to members of the working group that aren't on the BDAC. I know David Hartshorn might have had a comment, or anybody wanted to say anything. We have a few moments. I think maybe we could do that.
If you do have a comment, yeah, please approach the mic. Assuming it's working.
Can you hear me? Yes. We're good. Thank you. Yes, I did have comments. They were a long time ago. And I would just like to say that a lot of the comments and questions that were made by the BDAC members pinged on a number of the key issues that are recurring within the discussions of the groups. I'm not going to go into all of them, but you're right on the money, and know that we look forward to following up on all of those, including new technology. Is there the possibility to extend into the community for access that wasn't there before? The relationship of preparedness to response and to recovery, and the list goes on. So here again, I commend the BDAC for a very lively and productive discussion, and we look forward to honoring that with our continued work.
Thank you. Would you mind identifying yourself just for the...
Oh, yes. I'm David Hartshorn. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Geeks Without Frontiers.
Thank you. Any other comments from folks not on the BDAC? All right. At that point, we don't have OGC yet. Did I say that right? OCG? Yeah, OGC. We don't have OGC yet. So I would like to go to the end of the agenda and open up some discussion points for any topics that anyone may want to bring before this body at this time. So if you have things you'd like to share about what you're hoping to get out of BDAC, or what caused you to apply for BDAC, or anything along the lines of your interests or anything like that, this would be a good time for that as well. You applied for a reason, I know you did. Okay, so then I'm going to be mean and put the new members on the spot, because when we all joined the BDAC, we had to state what we hoped to get out of the BDAC and why we joined. So now you get to, lucky. And I'll let you pick who goes first, or else I'll just pick on you. See, he's lucky because I cannot see his name card. Are you here? Oh, okay. Oh, no, you're good. Okay, all right, you have a reprieve to think of your statements. I would like to introduce Paula Silberthau with the Office of General Counsel of the FCC, who's going to go over some ethical obligations.
Thank you. Sorry for the slight delay, apparently.
That's right.
The
We
time
were
kept
also ahead of
moving.
schedule, too. so-
Yeah. Well, we'll try to whip through this, too, because I hate to stand between people and lunch, or something like that. This is really not so much the ethics piece as just reviewing no, that's okay. It includes a little bit about that, but really just quickly reviewing where the structure comes from for having advisory committees. And while we always say we'd like to make it up as we go along, we can't entirely, because we're governed by the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and that, if you want to read it, it's actually very short. It's about 12 sections. It's in 5 USC Act 2. And as you go through it, you'll see it's based around 3 principles: openness in government, so hence the public meetings and advance notice. Diversity and balance in membership is actually sort of a statutory requirement and one enforced by GSA, and public accountability. And in addition, the act itself is really very basic, other than saying you have to have minutes of meeting, you have to have advance notice, you have to have diversity. You know, it's very, you can close meetings if things are confidential. It's pretty short, and there's sort of more elaboration in GSA's rules. Although everything could be subject to change, because apparently there's a bill that's whipping along in Congress that might change the ability to have working groups meet privately, which tends to be how things get done in terms of gathering information. But we'll see. It's proposed every year, and it sort of gets through one house and then gets blocked in the other, back and forth. So as far as the meetings, we have to give 15 calendar days notice. If there's like an emergency, we might, be able to do something on shorter notice, but because they're supposed to be open, the expectation is we need to give 15 days. And while the act is dated and that it says it must be published in the Federal Register, and we do that, we also try to do it and, announce it in more practical ways, public notices, and for you guys, emails, that kind of thing. These meetings of the parent group have to be kept open to the public, and that's a good thing, and meetings could also be held electronically, in which case we would provide some sort of phone access. That's another option. I don't think you'll get into it, but there are trade secret exceptions to the open meetings, so if you see something coming up that you actually think could be highly confidential, either a highly confidential business secret, a trade secret, something affecting foreign policy, that seems unlikely. But if that sort of thing happens, get in touch with your DFO, get in touch with Justin, and he'd get in touch with us, and I'd write something up, and the general counsel would most likely approve closing a portion of the meeting for that kind of thing. This has happened before, but it's pretty rare. Documents. On the closed meetings. For working groups, because working groups are not considered to be advisory committees, working groups can and usually do meet privately. And probably the best thing about that is that you can do things on the spur of the moment as long as your working group members are available and you don't have to have 15 days notice. If working groups were considered to be the same as you and subject to the 15 days, it would be very hard to schedule those kinds of things. Documents are publicly available, and that's required by the statute. And my request to you here is to please be sure to include your DFO on all communications, because we can't add the communications to our file if we don't have them. And then we'd all be in violation of the FACA requirements. The way we treat things is that all full committee communications, like recommendations from the working group that go up to to you guys as a group, those would definitely be considered FACA documents. Some of the other communications, like drafts that you might send to each other at the working group level would not would be part of the FCC records and subject to FOIA potentially, but they wouldn't be part of the, necessarily part of the official BDAC records. Final recommendations that you guys are considering would be part of the BDAC recommendations. But sort of ideas, conversations you have by email going back and forth on the working group level, we would probably treat those as being somewhat private, but nevertheless, the DFO needs to be included on all those emails so we can make that judgment and have a copy of the records. And I'm wasting time on this because, in fact, in the past, we've needed to produce some of those records and people forgot to include the DFO on them. And that was, troubling. So we're trying to keep everything, right on track. The focal point for communications with all of you should be the DFO or your chairperson. And as you probably know, the DFO sets the agenda, and our DFOs usually welcome suggestions, but usually the agenda comes through the commissioners, usually the chairman's office and the bureaus, and they take suggestions, but basically, there's sort of a line of command for the agenda. Other things, the informal working groups, there might be a working group you want to be on, but you can't. And the reason for that might be that no working group, because we're trying to make sure it's not the same as the parent group, no working group can have a number of participants that would exceed a quorum. So, if you're 20 people for the parent, we would keep it, whatever quorum, 21 people for the parent, we keep it 10 and under for the working group. Working groups, we are required to keep those balanced, just as your larger group has to be balanced. And we try to make appointments that reflect that balance. So that might be another reason that a group you're interested in, there might not just be room if your views would be very similar to someone who's already on it. Usually people have the working groups, as I said, be private. They don't have to be. So if there were some working group meeting that you thought it would be beneficial for some reason to open it up generally to members of the public, you can do that. But then you should work with the working group chair and with Justin so we could accommodate that. And we wouldn't necessarily have to give 15 days notice, but if you're going to open it up, it would have to be notice that was fair to everyone. So it couldn't be there were 5 people that you wanted to attend that meeting and you publicly announced the meeting that it's available to the public 3 hours before it starts. That would be silly. So, but anyhow, so you can do that, and at the working groups you can also have experts come in and give a presentation, run things back and forth with you. When they're done, the expert would have to leave because that person would not be part the working group, but you can, since working groups are supposed to be gathering information, you are allowed to have outsiders come in for presentations. I will say this, because we've seen this before, someone really liked an expert and kept inviting the same expert to every single meeting of the working group. So that expert was, the person was great, but this person was becoming a de facto member of the working group. So if there were someone like that you felt would be beneficial to the group, it would be possible to appoint people who aren't members of the BDAC to working groups. And in that case, please just get in touch with Justin. But no matter how fabulous someone is, they can't go to every meeting because then they become a member. Sometimes those things sort of develop spontaneously and you don't notice it till it's too late, but we try to restrict outside experts to like one meeting. Let's see what else. And the reason, the other thing that's really important is the working groups make recommendations to all of you, to the full group. The working group recommendations do not go directly to the commission, because if the working group recommendations went directly to the commission, The working group would be a de facto Federal Advisory Committee, and it would have violated the entire act because all the meetings would probably have been private. So that's why the working groups go to you. The committee as a whole needs to debate it. There shouldn't be rubber stamps. People not only are allowed to make recommendations, edit, discuss it, but we encourage a full discussion of the working group recs at this level. That doesn't mean you can't approve it. Usually, most of the recommendations get approved, but it should be after a full discussion and back and forth. Let's see. Oh, the other thing is that working groups shouldn't really be conducting surveys, because your group as a whole, plus the different working groups, anything that you do is sort of considered to be done in that sense by the FCC, and surveys can only be accomplished after approval of OMB through the Paperwork Reduction Act. So if a survey is done by a working group without, and then utilized without getting OMB approval, you probably couldn't rely on it. It would be a violation of the PRA, but more significantly, you couldn't then rely on the results. So if there is any kind of a survey and you see it coming in advance, some information you need, you could talk to Justin, and in theory, the agency could conduct the survey, or we could try to go through the Paperwork Reduction Act approval process, which I have tried to avoid the past 20 years. But I think it takes like 3 to 6 months. So it's a bit of a time-consuming process. Ex parte rules, was that already issued, the PN? Okay. So essentially, conversations you have at this meeting that are in the presence of staff who'd be working on an item, or possibly even be in the presence of the actual decision makers, the commissioners, those would be exempt from your having to file ex parte communications. And similarly, presentations involving working groups before staff who'd be working on an item are exempt. And potentially conversations that, like if the chair and a couple of people went to talk to the commissioners about a written recommendation that had already been voted, so the position was clear, but maybe you needed to clarify something for a commissioner, those would be exempt as well, with the exception that if any of those communications involve statements that the commission later wants to rely on, and it goes beyond the written recommendations that have already been posted and put in the docket, if you're working on something that's an NPRM, then there would be advance notice, and staff would have to put something in the record that would be comparable to an ex parte. So even though the communications are exempt in the interim, the commission's not going to rely on anything substantive unless it gets into the record and people can see it and have a chance to respond to it. I think that, yeah, and that's the important thing. And then the final thing is we've had issues from time to time with people who might want to put an opinion piece in a newspaper, which is fine if it's in your own name, or letters to the editor, or speaking before, a public group. It's fine if you do that and you make clear that you're acting, that this is your own opinion, and it's fine to give your opinion and, and you could mention that you're a member of the BDAC, but if you're going to reference membership on the BDAC, especially anyone who's the chair of a working group or the chairman or vice chairman, whatever, it should be clear that the statements that you write are your personal opinions. And we've had this happen in good faith, totally by accident, that someone gave a view, it was this is about 5 years ago, and something was extremely controversial. And the group was divided, and they gave this, sort of they gave their strong view on it, and then they signed it, so-and-so, chairman of the working group on whatever it was, and it looked as though that was the working group's view. And in fact, some people called and said, we can't believe the advisory committee has taken this view. Well, actually, it was just an opinion piece by someone who happened to be serving. So, just our request is to avoid confusion as to what sort of your official policy is versus, your private views. You'll need to make those distinctions if you do, presentations or newspaper opinion pieces. That's it. But I'll take any questions if someone has.
Just like to pose a hypothetical on the survey issue.
Mhm.
Maybe delineating the difference between research that a working group does on its own versus an information collection request versus a real survey. For example, job skills working group.
Mhm.
We may want to find out what community college programs are out there for training for these
Mhm.
skills. One thing we could do would be to research programs on the web ourselves. One thing would be
Fine, right.
we could email the dean of the school and say, can you send us a copy of your curriculum? A third thing might be developing a questionnaire. How much tuition do you charge? How many months does the program run? How long does it take to, those kinds of things. Does that become a survey? What's sort of the line between, you know what I'm saying?
Your independent research on the web, no problem, right? That's why you picked that one first, clearly not a survey. When you get to questionnaires, that starts looking like a survey. If you find out that some people have programs you're interested in checking into and you simply request a copy of materials, that would also seem fine. So I think the dividing line would be when you get to the survey piece. We've developed in different situations ways to avoid having something be a survey. Let Justin know if you feel the need to do something that you feel is sort of, you want to get material that's like a survey. For example, you might be able to pose, and this is definitely getting beyond my expertise, but you might be able to put something on the web, on the BDAC website, sort of in a sort of general way without having it be really specific questions, seek information sort of more generally and broadly about certain issues, almost like what we do with an NOI. And, if that's worded broadly enough, which people in my office could help you with, that would not be a survey. But we would not want questionnaires sent out. Yeah.
Yeah, a question on the similar line, and particularly, I do see that for the workforce development and training group, we may have to collect some information. But the question I had is that, can we rely on surveys done in the past? Or do we have to actually get some sort of clearance for some of the surveys done in the past?
You're saying, can you use information by the prior BDAC?
Not prior BDAC, but some surveys done, let's say NSF might have done some survey.
Just using someone else's public
something
information?
Done in
That's fine.
That's fine. Okay.
That's just part of information gathering. As long as we're not active,
Yeah.
as long as your group and hence the FCC are not actively doing a survey,
Okay.
you're okay. Yeah,
All
that's
right,
fine.
Thank you.
That's preferable. Yeah.
We're down here now.
Hello. Hi.
Hi there.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. I just want to make sure I solidify this concept in my mind. What could you give us an example of an ex parte communication that we as members of BDAC would have to disclose?
If you're having a communication with the decision maker during the meeting or sort of incidental to the meeting, and they say, someone comes up to you and says, that was a really interesting point you made, could you elaborate, that kind of thing, or at a working group meeting, that's fine. That would be covered by the exemption, because it's sort of during or incidental to. However, really the distinction is, if you went in and your organization has a specific perspective on some issue that's before the agency, simply because you're a member of the BDAC doesn't exempt your presentation representing your organization. It's only communication sort of incidental to a BDAC meeting or a working group meeting. Because obviously at the BDAC meeting, you might be giving your organization's view on something and explaining why you oppose or support a proposal. And you're supposed to be representing your organization in this context. But if separate from that on sort of the same issue, you know what I mean, your organization was doing a sort of a classic lobbying effort and having a private meeting with someone, that would be beyond the scope of this exemption.
Okay.
Can I?
Thank you.
Did that answer your question? Because I can try to give a hypothetical. So
More is better.
if I understand what you said, and just, because I've actually been navigating this for a couple of years, so make sure I'm doing it right. But, so let's say that the BDAC comes up with recommendation X, and the vote on it is close, and you have, 13 in favor, and 10 opposed, and 5 abstentions, and someone on the opposition side goes in and says, this is the BDAC's recommendation, but I disagree because of these 5 reasons. That would trigger an ex parte.
Yes, if they went in, they had a separate private meeting. If they had that, I mean, ironically, if they had that same comment during the voting meeting and said, I see everyone's voted this, and I just have to, I'm going to be voicing a dissent, and I want the dissent to be in the record, and here's what I think. That's fine because it's during the meeting and you're doing that, giving your view as a BDAC member. But then if you need, you're really concerned about it and you want to have a private meeting with staff or whoever outside the context of this group, that would trigger, that would be beyond the exemptions.
So the way I would think about it is it has to do with sunshine. So these meetings are public, so if you make that statement at these meetings, everyone knows what was said. But if you're having a private meeting with a staff or with somebody on the 8th floor, then nobody knows what was said except the people in the room, which is the entire point of an ex parte. So if you're talking about something that's already public, it's cool. But if you're talking about something that is different from or additional to something that is already public, then you would need to file an ex parte because no one else knows what was said but you and the person you're talking to.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, the only additional situation I could imagine would be, and I don't think this has really happened, but the BDAC votes out recommendations, and everyone thinks that they're clear, and everyone who's been involved thinks that they're clear, but a commissioner taking it up cold says, gee, I'm not really understanding what this means, or what I don't understand the implications. I don't think I understand this. So they call Justin, they say, can you get a couple people who are involved in this to come and just explain what is here, what this means. And in that case, maybe it would be the chair of the working group and someone who worked on the writing of the draft, and those people could go in. As long as they pretty much stay within the 4 corners, that would be fine. That would also be exempt, because no one would be pitching a different point of view or going beyond, hopefully much beyond what was stated there. If in that kind of a meeting, and that's where it gets sort of dicey, because this did happen, then the staff person or commissioner said, okay, I understand it, but how about this hypothetical? So, you know what I mean? Now we're sort of moving off of what the BDAC recommended and said, but what if we did this? Would this be good? How would the group feel about this? And then the person there would just have to say, well, I can't really explain what the BDAC would say to that because the BDAC didn't address it. I could give you the views of my organization. And at that point, the hats sort of switch.
That answer, okay. Any other questions? Thank you, that's all very good information that we needed to have.
Okay, and if any questions come up that relate to any of this stuff, ask Justin and I promise you he'll call me. Thanks a lot.
So,
you're welcome to take that.
So I just don't want everyone to get spoiled by how far ahead of schedule we are, because this is completely abnormal for this group. Those of us who have been here know that this does not happen. But we are going to take just a few minutes and let the new people give a more rounded introduction of what you all are hoping to get out of BDAC and kind of what drew you to it. It doesn't have to be super lengthy, just about a minute or two. I'm going to start with Jim and go around the table.
Sure. So I'm an alternate for Mark Gansey, who's not new to the BDAC.
Right.
And I think Digital Bridge and XNet sort of share a similar view and interest in the work within the BDAC. As I said earlier, XNet's a very large provider of densified and distributed networks across all of North America. So some of the key topics that we've talked about here are key and core to our business. And on a personal note, I'm personally very interested in delivering a broadband connectivity to the rural market, so I'm quite interested in participate there as well.
Thank you. I think, Julia, you're next.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be back in DC with many of my friends now that I'm a California girl. So Loon was born out of Google X, the Moonshot Factory, and the goal of Google X is to take some of the world's biggest problems and solve them, and that includes things like self-driving cars and delivery drones, and this whole balloons in the stratosphere was born out of the need to connect the vast majority of the world that isn't connected. So we have a great deal of interest in the U.S. In solving problems when we have natural disasters, not only in the U.S. but around the world. So here we are at the BDAC. We feel like the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee could not be more aptly named for the mission that we're trying to accomplish. And I'm the first head of regulatory affairs, as we have launched, are starting to launch commercially, finding partners around the globe. We realize that regulations are not really existent for what we're trying to do. So we hope here in the BDAC that we can work together to lay the groundwork for regulations, not only in the US, but around the world, so we can deliver from way up in the stratosphere.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Tom, I think you're next.
Sure. So, I guess, yeah, a bit more background on our street and what I hope to bring to the table, because, of course, I work on telecom policy, but our street is engaged in lots of other different policy areas, including education policy, criminal justice, energy, workplace development, occupational licensing, a lot of things that I hope to bring to the table when it comes to.
I'm really sorry to do this to you. You may want to slow down just slightly, because they're trying to transcribe, and I don't think they can follow you.
Sure.
I typed pretty fast, and I couldn't follow that.
Anyway, so hope to bring some of that to the table when it comes to deployment job skills and training opportunities, because, of course, that is significant input into the cost of deploying broadband, and if we get more qualified people out into the workforce, that drives down the cost of broadband deployment, and theoretically we'll get more broadband deployed throughout America, which I very much like and support. From my time growing up in central Kansas, from Salina, we were Cox customers going way back, and I was a big fan of that as a sort of my lifeline to the rest of the world and sort of culture and a lot of things I couldn't get in central Kansas. And now it's helpful. I mean, I live in D.C. and have for over a decade, but now it's helpful for staying in touch with family back home in Kansas and Oklahoma and other places in the country. So very much like broadband. Excited to work and continue to explore different aspects of the industry and sort of the challenges that are out there that we can try and, through public policy, overcome and try to make the world better. I don't know.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
That was good. You slowed it down. Kurt.
Thank you. So part of it is as a recovering state regulator, always been interested in trying to solve, the issue of rural broadband and more specifically unserved broadband. And, Cox and the cable industry worked really hard, I think last year on the Farm Bill to try to modify some of those programs at USDA and elsewhere to provide more transparency, make sure those dollars are going where they should be. The Reconnect program last year also created some opportunities to target those funding opportunities. So, one of the things for us we've seen as we work with state legislatures and others to try to tackle the issue of rural broadband is kind of the other piece of unserved or the left out folks are those people that are just outside of town. So they may not meet the definition of the traditional rural programs. We had some areas we looked at in the Reconnect program that are between a town of 20,000 and a town of 30,000, and they're as unserved as somebody out in the middle of nowhere. So how do you make sure that those folks who are just as disconnected as someone who's up on top of the mountain does? So how do we, because that's the challenge, right? We've got kind of the 20% or whatever the magic number is of unserved people, is how do we surgically target programs to get to those folks without unnecessarily overbuilding existing private investment and things like that. So I think that's kind of the perspective and the hope I bring to the table.
Delete.
Well, so TIA represents the hardware guys, which I think is maybe not a perspective that's very common around the table here. Although you buy our products, my companies actually make them. So I think offering a hardware manufacturer's perspective from the perspective of a company that actually builds the routers and builds the boxes that everyone is putting up, I think that's the reason why I sought to join the BDAC, to try and offer that perspective where I could. And I know that, as we're talking about job skills, which is the working group that I've been assigned to, and, for example, our companies are always looking out for more electrical engineers, to build the boxes. I know that's a little different from the focus of this in terms of broadband deployment, but I just want to see where that interface point is between actual deployment and how the boxes are built and what the connections are there in terms of the skills. Also, personally, before I went to the dark side, before I went to law school, my undergrad background was actually in electrical engineering, computer science, and my parents are both university professors. So thinking about job skills and workforce training, I just think I can bring some perspective there and look forward to learning more about how those training programs work, because I think it could really be a useful source of jobs in this economy as well to deploy broadband, and I'm just excited to see where that can go.
Perfect, thank you. I think, Tim, you're next.
Really my perspective is how can we continue collectively to influence and continue the investment and accelerate the investment of broadband capability, capacity, connectivity into rural America. How do we think about this problem and think about it very different from a collaborative environment versus everybody building its own separate parallel network? So, my excitement about the group is bringing subject matter experts together to solve a common problem and do it very, very different than how we've done it in the past, through collaboration, whether that collaboration be a new technology, whether it be a new partnership, whether it be a new investment, a new business structure. So that's really where I'm coming from.
Thank you.
Well, as I mentioned with the first introduction, NATOA's members are local governments, and they're the officials and their advisors who work on communications issues. And one of the biggest issues for local government, like for all of us, is broadband deployment. And so, we really wanted to be part of this group so that we can be involved in discussions about broadband deployment, and really to bring the local government perspective, which has already been on the committee, but just to talk more about local government's role in broadband deployment.
Leticia.
Thank you. So we as Neptuno sit in a very unique perspective. It's a family-owned company like Michael's. My father founded it 50 years ago, and throughout those 50 years, we deployed over 10,000 towers, mostly international in what you would call also challenge areas like the Caribbean Basin and such. So as we've been involved in the U.S., we've been here 19 years already as a U.S. company. We interact with the infrastructure vendors. Now we are part of the Smart City Task Force, so we're getting involved with the cities. And really the BDAC, for us, it's a great opportunity to voice a different perspective from people that are installing towers like ourselves. And when we need to tap into new resources, that's becoming very, very challenging. Or we want to deploy new technology and take broadband to unserved areas, and you see resistance also from city officials. So definitely a genuine interest in how can we work better across all stakeholders and make a positive change.
Thank you. Melissa.
A lot more people than I was expecting. Well, so hi, Melissa Slauson again, GeoLink. So my boss was on the BDAC last time around, so GeoLinks itself is not new.
Right.
But I am. So just from a company perspective, it's good to see a lot of WISP representation at the table, but I think in previous iterations of this and probably other working groups, that hasn't always been the case. And so we're happy to be a part of it and offer our unique perspective and the challenges that we face as a WISP and opportunities that we see to fill gaps in the industry just because of the technologies that we use. In addition to that, we're on the Disaster Response and Recovery Working Group in part because GeoLinks was directly affected by the Thomas Fire in 2018 in the Ventura County area. We had several of our employees living in our offices for a number of weeks while they were evacuated from their homes. And so something near and dear to our hearts and something very important for us to be working on. And then just from a personal perspective, connectivity has always been an important topic for me. I am also a former regulator. I worked at the California Public Utilities Commission. I've worked in the Lifeline space and the Universal Service space. And so happy to be here.
Claude.
I will echo that it's great to see so many WISPs represented here today. I'm here because I like collecting these yellow table tents. But no, thank you. But no, in all seriousness, WISPA is an organization that represents the folks who are small mom and pop broadband providers who are profitably deploying service and infrastructure where no terrestrial company has gone before. So at a macro level, there are insights that we think we can bring to this committee as we're all talking about broadband deployment, but then also to take learnings back from larger providers who have more standardized ways of doing things. I think we have a lot to contribute and a lot to learn, and I'm just excited to be here.
Scott.
I think I'm next.
You are.
Scott Rudd with State of Indiana. One of my colleagues said something recently I think applies to the situation well. He said, this really isn't rocket science. It's more complicated than that. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think, Indiana's administration and legislature and counties, cities, and towns are taking this challenge very seriously and passing some very proactive policies and legislation that will create a more attractive investment climate in Indiana. And that's resulted in some leading 5G investments and significant REMC interest in the broadband space due to some passing of legislation. Not to mention that recently Governor Holcomb announced a $100 million Next Level Connections broadband grant program for these unserved areas, and that is rolling out as we speak, just concluding a challenge process, I believe, last week. We're also seeing deep engagement at the county levels and city and town levels passing broadband ready policies that expedite permitting and right-of-ways to 10 days and waive all fees and no moratoriums and things such as that. A handful of counties are also passing tax exemptions for investment in broadband in unserved areas. We're seeing significant federal funds come in. Approximately 20 counties have stood up broadband task forces in recent months, and they are specifically compiling a group of really diverse stakeholders who are really proactively targeting each and every barrier and reducing those barriers and bringing resources for adoption to the table. Yet we know still more is needed. And this is where I think there is no silver bullet here. It's more about buckshot. And to the gentleman over here's point, we need a very diverse group of folks and stakeholders to come to the table, such as AARP, Farm Bureau, hospitals, libraries, schools, providers, counties, cities, and towns to really move the needle on this issue. And I think, if we could align our federal, state, local, and private entities with a focus on reducing costs and expediting investment, coming up with some new creative ways to improve adoption, I think we'll see some progress there.
Thank you. I think you're next.
Great.
There's so many good things I think I would agree with that's been said already. I would tell you, Connected Nation, we're inspired by our mission to, everyone belongs. And, we look at our mission holistically, as I mentioned at the first introduction. Access, adoption, and use is kind of how we measure those things, but it all starts with access. And so if we don't have that, none of those other longer tail initiatives really ever come to fruition. So I think we feel an obligation after the number of years we've been fortunate enough to be at this, and seeing the diverse communities in which we've engaged, from Barrow, Alaska to San Juan. I think we, and in that spirit of more of a collaborative agent, and so we do seek to mine and harvest a lot of diverse and sometimes opposing viewpoints, but it's all intended to aggregate and bring salient information and recommendations to bear. So it's a skin we're very comfortable in. I think particularly with this, I think everyone at this table would agree, what an exciting time, because there's so much emphasis now and capitalization and this race to get infrastructure out. And so it's a very exciting time, I think, for us to engage in this work collectively. I look forward to doing that with everyone here at this table, and certainly looking forward to the working groups as well. So I think that's what I would offer. It's a great time to be here, and I think we have a moral obligation to share collectively what we've all experienced at this point to make our nation competitive again.
I think we're around on this side now.
Yeah, I guess we jumped a few people here. Again, Tom Ellison from T-Mobile. And I guess, first of all, I just want to say I'm excited to be working with just an unbelievably diverse group of people here. I look around the table, and I think when I started looking at the people that are sitting around the table, it wasn't lost on me just the diversity and the different groups that are absolutely involved in BDAC. From a wireless carrier perspective, I think we have just a keen interest in BDAC and all of the working groups that we're talking about, whether or not disaster recovery or rural or low-income broadband coverage. I think we have a keen interest in all of these. It's interesting to see. My own personal working group is the rural or low-income broadband coverage, and I think as T-Mobile, this is certainly a keen area for us and a focus for us as we progress forward in rolling out not only coverage but new technology. And I think even more so, it's a very interesting time in the wireless business, as we are in the middle of what we would typically call a G upgrade, and obviously you don't go very far without hearing 5G and the technology supporting that. And so it'll be interesting to me to see how we start to apply some of this new technology as well as the older technologies in groups like BDAC and the working groups as such. So overall, absolutely looking forward to working with this group and providing input to the team.
All right, I'm next. Eve Lewis again, City of Coconut Creek. Let me first tell you a little bit about the city. We're in South Florida, once again, in Broward County, and sustainable development is at the heart of the city's mission. We put a lot of emphasis into ensuring that our residents and business owners enjoy the environment and the community that they live in. And we are always looking to the future, looking into new technologies, how to, devise smart cities. And really, I appreciate that my organization has sent me on this mission to join you all to learn more about this growing industry. When I reference it, I mean 5G, the G transition, as was mentioned by Tom. But in essence, Coconut Creek uniquely has what, if not the most or the largest contiguous undeveloped privately owned piece of land in South Florida. And we are hopeful that that is going to be what's called our Main Street Downtown Development District. So we are looking to see what opportunities technology has for that area. And specifically for me, I'm sort of on the ground floor. I am the one that takes all of the rights-of-way registrations for all communication service providers. So I get to review that on a daily basis. It's just one thing that I touch on a daily basis. I joke with my friends, I am the modern day, I guess, general practitioner. I touch so many areas of the law, but telecommunications has a soft spot. I have a journalism telecommunications degree, dual degree from the University of Florida with poli-sci, and then I went to law school following that. So public service has always been an interest of mine, and I used to be a prosecutor in the state attorney's office down in Broward County, and then I transitioned over to the more uplifting side of government work, which is local government. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I am looking forward to getting to know each and every one of you very well. And once again, thanks.
Thank you. I think that is everyone who's new. I'd like to open it up at this time for general comments or questions, if anyone has any. Yes.
I just wanted to make a general comment. I'm really excited with the news today that we have new chairs of the working groups, in particular that WI member Neptuno, who's represented by Leticia Latino, is going to be chairing the working group on workforce issues. She has really been a leader in this, an innovator, somebody who actually does the work on the ground with a company that's changed the face of wireless infrastructure all around the world and has had to take it upon herself to do some training, to learn how to do it on her own, to help very large companies to improve their own internal training programs. So she's going to bring a breath of fresh air and on-the-ground experience to that working group. So thank you for being willing to step up and do that with all that you have going on in the private sector. And you have an excellent partner in the vice chair, Dr. Rickon Thacker. When it comes to experience in this field, there's nobody more qualified than Dr. Thacker, who has been teaching in this area. He has been a leader in training for the wireless infrastructure industry. He's somebody we've worked with that we use as a trainer on our own, somebody who's been a leader within WIA as the head of our working group on skilled workforce, and helped put together a paper that really laid out this issue and the demands for this issue that we put out. Is available on our website now. Thank you, Dr. Thacker, for the work with that. And also our partner, MMTC, who is a leader in apprenticeships. So he brings together an expertise on training in general and apprenticeships. So what an excellent choice of leadership by the FCC to help lead us forward and make sure we have the workforce that we need to build out these 5G networks. So I just wanted to note what qualified leaders we have for that working group. Such a...
Right, okay. Michael.
I'd like to echo also what I've heard, that this is a very diverse group. Everyone here is at the top of their pyramids. We have lots of other things to do in our very busy lives, and we've dedicated to come here together for the purposes outlined before. As I experienced in the last session, right after this session, we'll read in the press how the press is trying to divide us into different factions. I mean, we're male, we're female, we're providers, we're public, private groups. Just a caveat for the new people here, the process last time, we started off with thousands of pages of comments. We distilled that into hundreds of pages of committee work that had really good ideas. But when we got here to try to build consensus, we came out with, in my mind, we lost a lot of good ideas along the way in the striving to build consensus. Remember that compromise, by definition, is where everybody loses. Got that? It takes a lot more effort to do synergy, to come together. You have to understand, you have to take your blinders off and get to see the overall picture. But if we put enough work into understanding all sides of the issues, we can accomplish a whole lot. Again, we did wonderful things last session. We didn't get everything done, though. This is not just, I don't want it to be a trilogy, but we have an opportunity here to get some more things done. And if we, again, work together on synergy, I think we'll be able to get, not have to strike so many articles this time. And again, I'm very, very glad to be here. I don't know, I mean, the first time I wasn't sure why I was appointed, and I'm not sure why I'm here the second time as I look around and see all the talents here. I do need to let you know that I'm an engineer by nature, by nurture, training, practice. I have a Y chromosome. My wife, the psychologist, says I have 2 of them, which means that I see the world a certain way, and it's hard for me to get outside of that a little bit. But anyway, I'm glad to be here, and I'm grateful for my company to help to pay for the hotel last night. Oh, and don't forget, there's chocolate over here. Please don't make me take it home. I've already gained way too much weight this last year.
Mr. Michael is
Thank you.
famous for the chocolate. He said people were probably tired of it by now, and I said, well, I'm not. So you will be very grateful when these are two-day meetings that Michael comes with chocolate. Go ahead.
That was about to hit my dumb newbie question. So September 19th, 20th, December 2nd and 3rd, those are two-day meetings?
You should plan for them to be. They may not end up being, but for blocking it off on your calendar, yes, please.
Like 9
block
to 5
both
on
days.
both days? Okay.
Yeah, my guess is, at least for the one in September, it won't be. It'll probably be a day and a half at the most, but yeah, it's always safer to overplan and then step back, so we're assuming that there'll be 2 full days, and if you sort of plan like that, then it won't be wrong.
Is there like a structured evening activity on the first night or anything like that?
No.
Nothing like that?
We put it, yes, we all like text each other sitting at this table and say, where are we going to get a
Understood.
drink?
Understood.
So, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, what's
It'll be
for
a
lunch?
lot- Yeah, Kelly's planning it. Yes, sir.
Thank you, and very quickly, a few things. First of all, Jonathan, thanks for the wooden conference. I mean, we are definitely going to meet the expectation and probably deliver more than what's expected from this group, and I'm looking forward to working with our group chair here, Letitia. And I was going to mention to Michael that please make sure that you bring candies. I mean, whenever I say BDAC in home, my kids say that are going to bring candy. So appreciate that. And one more on lighter comment that coming from BDAC 1.0 to 2.0, and we talk about this trilogy and everything. I think last time it felt like Avengers Infinity War. This time I'm hoping it's Endgame. So just
With
want
fewer
to mention
deaths.
that. And lastly, Justin, are we going to see the announcement soon? We are eager to know who is going to be members in our groups. I know some of them mentioned to me, but what's the process as the next step?
Sure.
Okay. Yep.
So the process is, we're still running through the ethics clearing on a couple people. You all kind of went through that process. And ultimately, it takes the individual who's being cleared to send all the appropriate documentation back to ethics. I want to make clear our ethics team is awesome and they're working really hard, but we're just waiting for a few more people. Once we do get clearance, then we'll put out a public notice announcing everybody who's going to be on the working group. Prior to putting out that public notice, I'll email everyone so that you guys know what's coming, or our distinguished chair may do so. We'll kind of talk to see who wants to send it. So you guys will know who's going to be on the working groups before everybody else does, but it'll come out pretty close between because we don't want to have any transparency issues. So like I said, we're hoping to get that out as soon as possible. If it's up to me, early next week would be great, but we'll see what happens with the ethics team.
Did you have something else you wanted to say?
Yeah, so just in general, we heard a lot about kind of the Paperwork Reduction Act and other FACA and ethics issues earlier. If you have any questions, please email me. These are really tricky issues, and especially with the PRA procedures, we've ran into that in different FACAs in the past, and I am happy to work with you guys to make sure we don't run into anything else, because if we do run across it, it makes life so much more difficult for me and for you guys, and neither of us want to go through that. So let's make sure, if you think you might be even coming close to it, just ping me and we can talk it through, and I can pull our general counsel's team in, and we'll be good.
Okay. So in closing, I would like to thank, oh, sorry, Larry. No, please speak. I don't need to close.
Okay.
If you have something to say, go ahead.
Just want to say, first of all, it's been a real honor to serve, and I think we made a lot of progress over the last 2 years, but now we have a new challenge before us, and it's an exciting one, and it again will take a lot of heavy lifting to get where we need to be. But also just want to mention that as we look to solve some of these issues, that all barriers are not regulatory in nature, and I think to address some of these issues, we need to be open-minded to addressing barriers that exist and not limiting ourselves in our thought process to merely those that might be perceived as regulatory in nature.
So make a quick check real quick. Okay, now, in closing. I want to make a couple of statements. First of all, I know that 5G is huge, and it's, of course, the catchphrase du jour, but this is not a 5G body. And we have a lot of responsibility here, with particularly on the hands of jobs creation and infrastructure groups and disaster recovery issues. It's not all about how fast can we get out 5G. It's about how fast can we get broadband to the people who don't have it, whether those people are rural or in cities or in between cities, which is a very excellent point that Kurt made earlier, is that you have these donut areas that don't qualify for anything, and that's our job. It's our job to address that holistically. And I'm really pleased by the diversity we have here and who's represented in this room. I think that we have a great group of people. I'm really proud of the group, the work the BDAC group did last year, and I know that we can absolutely meet or exceed that with this talented group of people. So thank you all for bringing your time, your energy, and your intent to this body, and I look forward to working with you. And with that, we are adjourned. Yay!